Welcome, weary wanderer, to the enigmatic town of Gravity Falls, Oregon. Tonight, we'll unravel every cipher, decode every mystery, and explore the deepest secrets hidden within this supernatural corner of the world. From ancient symbols carved in forgotten caves to interdimensional beings beyond mortal comprehension, this is a journey through mysteries that span centuries and realities. So settle in, get comfortable, and let your mind drift as we decode the cryptic messages that define this strange and wonderful place. There's no rush here, no need to solve every puzzle yourself. Just let the secrets wash over you like morning mist through the pines. Close your eyes when you're ready, and let's begin. In the dense forests of northwestern Oregon, where ancient Douglas firs reach towards skies that seem to hold more secrets than stars, there exists a town that defies every law of physics, probability, and rational thought that humanity has ever conceived. Gravity Falls appears on most maps as nothing more than a small logging community. Population 943, notable only for its tourist traps and its inexplicably high rate of missing persons reports that somehow never quite make it into the official statistics. Yet those who look deeper, those who dare to question the convenient explanations and comfortable lies that shroud this place like morning fog, discover something far more extraordinary than any ordinary settlement carved from the wilderness. This is a place where the impossible becomes routine, where the laws of nature bend and break like saplings in a hurricane, and where mysteries layer upon mysteries in patterns so complex they seem to form their own kind of logic. The foundation of Gravity Falls' strangeness reaches back far beyond the arrival of the first European settlers, beyond even the oral traditions of the Native American peoples who once called this land home. Deep in the earth beneath the town, in caverns that predate human civilization by geological ages, ancient symbols are carved into living rock, with a precision that suggests tools and knowledge far beyond anything the primitive world should have possessed. These symbols, discovered only in fragments and glimpses by the few brave or foolish enough to explore the deepest caves, speak of forces and entities that existed when the world was young and the barriers between dimensions were thin as spider silk. They tell of a time when reality itself was more fluid, when the impossible was merely improbable, and when beings of unimaginable power walked freely between worlds that modern science insists must be forever separate. The indigenous peoples who first encountered these carvings understood, with the wisdom that comes from living close to the earth and its ancient rhythms, that some knowledge is too dangerous to preserve in anything but whispered legends and half-remembered dreams. Their stories speak of a place where the spirits of earth and sky and water gathered to hold counsel, where the boundaries between the world of the living and the realm of dreams grew thin enough to step across like crossing a shallow stream. They called it the place where time forgets itself, a name that captures something essential about the nature of Gravity Falls that even the most detailed scientific analysis fails to convey. Time does not flow normally here, pooling in some places like water behind a dam while rushing through others with the violence of a spring flood. Visitors often report losing hours or even days without explanation, while others claim to have experienced weeks of adventure in the span of a single afternoon. The first European to document these temporal anomalies was one, Jebediah Cornerstone, an explorer and surveyor who arrived in the region in the autumn of 1852 with the ambitious goal of mapping the unmappable wilderness for the territorial government. His journals, discovered nearly a century later in a cave system that official geological surveys insist does not exist, describe encounters with phenomena that would have been dismissed as the ravings of a madman if not for the meticulous detail and scientific precision with which he recorded them. Cornerstone wrote of trees that aged backward during certain phases of the moon, of streams that flowed uphill towards springs that seemed to emerge from thin air, and of wildlife that displayed intelligence and behaviors far beyond what natural selection should have produced. His sketches, executed with the careful attention to detail of a trained naturalist, show creatures that seem to be assembled from the parts of different animals, as if some cosmic child had been playing an elaborate game of mix and match with the fundamental patterns of life itself. Most disturbing of all were his accounts of the local Native American tribe, whose members seemed to possess an understanding of these anomalies that bordered on the supernatural. They spoke of the forest as if it were a living entity with its own consciousness and will, of animals that carried messages between the worlds, and of a great sleeping power that lay beneath the earth waiting for some unknown signal to awaken. Cornerstone's final journal entry, dated December 31st, 1852, speaks of a revelation so profound and terrifying that he dared not record it in plain language. Instead, he created the first known cipher to be associated with gravity falls, a simple substitution code that would not be cracked until decades after his mysterious disappearance. When finally decoded, his last words were both prophecy and warning. The sleeper stirs, the wheel turns, the time of choosing draws near. The establishment of permanent settlement in the region began in earnest during the 1870s, when the arrival of railroad surveying teams made the area accessible to the logging industry that would define its early character. Yet even from these first days of organized development, the town that would become Gravity Falls attracted more than its share of unusual residents and bizarre incidents. Silas Birchwood, the entrepreneur who established the first sawmill on the site where the town square now stands, kept detailed records of his business operations that reveal a pattern of anomalies that would have bankrupted any venture in a more normal location. His ledgers record the mysterious appearance of fully processed lumber in his mill yard on mornings when no work had been scheduled, the spontaneous transformation of ordinary pine logs into varieties of wood that botanists insisted could not exist, and the frequent malfunction of machinery in ways that seemed to violate the basic principles of engineering. Rather than flee these impossible circumstances, Birchwood adapted to them with the pragmatic flexibility that would become a defining characteristic of the town's residents across the generations. He learned to expect the unexpected, to plan for impossibilities, and to find ways to profit from phenomena that would have driven lesser men to distraction or madness. His mill became the first business in Gravity Falls to adopt what historians now recognize as the fundamental survival strategy of the community, the careful balance between acknowledgement and denial that allows people to function normally in circumstances that are anything but normal. This delicate psychological equilibrium became encoded in the town's culture through a series of informal but strictly observed social customs. Residents learned to discuss unusual events only in certain contexts and with certain people, to maintain multiple explanations for the same phenomena depending on who was asking, and to develop what psychologists would later term selective attention disorder, the ability to simply not notice things that are too strange to fit comfortably into one's worldview. The arrival of Nathaniel Northwest in the spring of 1883 marked the beginning of what historians call the Gilded Age of Gravity Falls. Though the gold that flowed through the community during this period came from sources that official records carefully avoid examining too closely. Northwest, a railroad baron whose fortune had been built on routes that connected impossible destinations in impossible times, recognized immediately that Gravity Falls represented an opportunity beyond the dreams of ordinary entrepreneurs. Where other men saw obstacles and anomalies, Northwest perceived resources and possibilities. The temporal distortions that made scheduling so difficult for normal businesses could be exploited by someone clever enough to understand their patterns. The strange wildlife that terrorized conventional hunters could be captured and displayed for the entertainment of wealthy tourists with exotic tastes. Most importantly, the barriers between dimensions that occasionally grew thin enough to permit travel could be used to import goods and materials from places that existed beyond the reach of normal commerce. The Northwest Mansion, constructed over the course of just 18 months despite its incredible size and complexity, stands as a monument to the possibilities that emerge when unlimited wealth meets unlimited strangeness. The building incorporates architectural elements that belong to no known historical period, constructed from materials that geologists insist could not occur naturally on Earth, and designed according to principles that seem to violate basic structural engineering while somehow remaining perfectly stable across more than a century of use. Hidden within the mansion's labyrinthine interior are rooms and passages that serve purposes far removed from ordinary domestic life. Secret chambers contain collections of artifacts gathered from expeditions to places that appear on no earthly map, while hidden laboratories preserve the results of experiments that mainstream science would consider both impossible and unethical. Most mysterious of all is the mansion's basement level, which, according to the original architectural plans, should not exist, but which servants' accounts describe as extending far deeper into the earth than any conventional foundation would require. The Northwest family's influence on Gravity Falls extended far beyond their personal eccentricities or their exotic business ventures. Nathaniel Northwest understood, with the cold calculation of a successful predator, that a community built on secrets requires careful management if those secrets are to remain profitable rather than merely dangerous. He established the social and economic structures that would allow the town to maintain its facade of normalcy while accommodating levels of strangeness that would have exposed less carefully managed communities to unwanted attention from the outside world. The most important of these innovations was the creation of what Northwest privately called the Circle of Silence, a loose confederation of the town's most influential families bound together by mutual self-interest and shared knowledge of truths too valuable to share. Members of the circle learned to coordinate their stories, to support each other's lies, and to present a united front against any outside investigation that might threaten their profitable arrangement with the impossible. This conspiracy of silence was formalized through a series of legal and financial mechanisms that made exposure of the town's secrets literally impossible without destroying the economic foundation upon which the entire community depended. Property deeds contained clauses that voided ownership if certain information was disclosed to unauthorized parties. Business contracts included penalty clauses so severe that bankruptcy would be preferable to revelation. Most ingeniously, the town's charter incorporated provisions that automatically transferred municipal authority to predetermined successor governments in the event that certain sensitive topics became the subject of public discussion. Yet, even these carefully constructed barriers against revelation could not completely contain the strangeness that pulsed through Gravity Falls like blood through living veins. The town's isolation helped, certainly, and the rugged terrain that surrounded it made casual visits difficult and extended investigation nearly impossible. But the truly effective protection came from something far more subtle and powerful than legal documents or geographical barriers. Gravity Falls developed what anthropologists would recognize as a defense mechanism common to communities that exist on the margins of consensual reality: the ability to make itself forgettable. Visitors arrived with clear intentions and specific goals, only to find their attention gradually drifting toward more mundane concerns. Investigators came seeking evidence of particular anomalies, only to discover that their research had somehow transformed into studies of local history or regional geology. Even residents sometimes found that memories of the strangest events faded faster than they should, leaving behind only vague impressions and half-remembered dreams. This selective amnesia was not the result of any deliberate intervention or supernatural influence, but rather emerged naturally from the human mind's desperate need to make sense of experiences that defied explanation. When confronted with evidence that reality itself might be far stranger and more dangerous than civilized life assumes, most people unconsciously choose to forget rather than face the implications of what they have witnessed. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw gravity falls develop from a simple logging community into a fully realized pocket of controlled chaos, where the impossible had been domesticated just enough to coexist with the demands of modern civilization. The town acquired all the standard institutions of American municipal life: banks and schools and churches and government offices, but each of these apparently normal organizations had been subtly modified to accommodate circumstances that would have bewildered their counterparts in more conventional communities. The Gravity Falls Elementary School, for example, incorporated into its standard curriculum special courses designed to help children develop the mental flexibility necessary to function in an environment where the laws of physics were more like suggestions than absolute rules. Students learn not only reading and arithmetic, but also practical skills like how to recognize when they were experiencing temporal displacement, how to communicate with animals that displayed above-average intelligence, and how to avoid making eye contact with entities that might not be entirely present in their current dimension. The First Church of Gravity Falls, meanwhile, developed theological frameworks capable of incorporating divine intervention that took forms far more direct and dramatic than the subtle workings of providence that characterized religious experience in more ordinary locations. Sermons regularly addressed topics like the proper response to miraculous manifestations, the spiritual significance of encounters with beings from other planes of existence, and the moral obligations of humans who found themselves temporarily granted supernatural abilities. Even the town's law enforcement agencies evolved specialized procedures for dealing with crimes and emergencies that would have left conventional police departments helplessly confused. Sheriff's deputies learned to investigate robberies where the stolen goods had been taken backward through time, to respond to domestic disturbances involving family members who existed only on alternate Tuesdays, and to maintain public order. During festival days, when the boundary between dream and reality became so thin that citizens' unconscious minds could physically reshape their environment. This careful integration of the impossible with the mundane created a unique social environment that attracted certain types of individuals while repelling others. Gravity Falls became a haven for people whose talents or interests or simple bad luck had made them misfits in the normal world, drawing together a community of individuals who had learned to find comfort in strangeness and meaning in mystery. Scientists whose theories were too radical for conventional academia found in Gravity Falls a living laboratory where their most speculative hypotheses could be tested under field conditions. Artists whose visions were too strange for traditional galleries discovered audiences capable of appreciating works that existed partially in other dimensions. Philosophers whose questions probed too deeply into the nature of reality found fellow seekers willing to explore territories where conventional wisdom feared to venture. Yet this influx of extraordinary individuals also brought with it new dangers and complications. The very people most attracted to Gravity Falls' mysteries were often those least equipped to handle them responsibly. Brilliant minds intoxicated by unlimited access to impossible phenomena sometimes lost sight of basic caution or ethical constraints. Ambitious researchers, freed from the skeptical oversight of conventional institutions, occasionally pursued investigations that placed not only themselves but the entire community at risk. The most dangerous of these scholarly adventurers was a young man named Stanford Pines, who arrived in Gravity Falls during the spring of 1975, with 6 fingers on each hand, 12 PhDs from prestigious universities, and an obsession with anomalous phenomena that would ultimately threaten the very fabric of reality itself. But that particular story, with its ciphers and journals and interdimensional nightmares, belongs to chapters yet to come in our journey through the mysteries that define this impossible town. For now, it is enough to understand that by the time Stanford Pines began his fateful research, Gravity Falls had spent more than a century learning to balance on the knife's edge between the possible and the impossible, creating a community where secrets were currency, mysteries were infrastructure, and the inexplicable had become as ordinary as sunrise. The foundation was laid, the stage was set, and the greatest mystery in the town's long history of mysteries was about to begin. The arrival of Stanford Philbrick Pines in Gravity Falls on the morning of June 15, 1975, marked the beginning of the most dangerous period in the town's long history of flirtations with the impossible. He came not as a tourist seeking novelty, or as a businessman pursuing profit, but as a scholar whose hunger for knowledge had grown so vast and consuming that it threatened to devour not only himself, but everything he touched in his relentless pursuit of truth. Ford, as he preferred to be called by the few who knew him well enough to use familiar names, possessed the kind of brilliant, restless mind that conventional academia both cherished and feared. His 12 doctoral degrees represented not mere accumulation of credentials, but a genuine mastery of disciplines so diverse that most universities lacked faculty qualified to properly evaluate his work. Physics and mathematics certainly, but also anthropology and linguistics, archaeology and comparative mythology, theoretical engineering, and what he privately called applied impossibility studies. Yet it was not his intellectual achievements that first marked Ford as different from other residents of Gravity Falls, remarkable though those achievements were. It was the simple biological fact that he had been born with 6 fully functional fingers on each hand, a genetic anomaly that had shaped his entire relationship with a world designed for those blessed with more conventional anatomy. In a normal town, this physical difference might have made Ford a curiosity, or perhaps an object of pity. In Gravity Falls, where the impossible had been domesticated into the merely unusual, his extra digits were recognized immediately as a sign of something far more significant than mere genetic variation. The oldest residents, those whose memories stretched back to the frontier days when the barriers between worlds were thinner, whispered among themselves that hands like Ford's appeared in their community only when reality itself was preparing for some fundamental change. The house that Ford rented on the outskirts of town, a modest cabin that had previously served as a retreat for visiting scholars and the occasional eccentric millionaire, underwent rapid transformation under his occupancy. What had been simple rooms designed for rest and contemplation became laboratories equipped with instruments that most universities could not afford, and some that most scientists would not recognize. Ford's equipment reflected not only his vast technical knowledge, but also his willingness to explore theoretical possibilities that more cautious researchers avoided. Electromagnetic field generators hummed alongside devices designed to measure temporal distortions. Spectrographic analyzers shared bench space with machines built to detect interdimensional radiation signatures. Most mysterious of all were the instruments Ford had designed and built himself, devices that seemed to violate basic principles of engineering while somehow functioning with precision that surpassed commercially manufactured alternatives. The transformation extended beyond mere equipment into the very structure of knowledge itself. Ford approached the study of gravity falls anomalies with a systematic rigor that the town's previous researchers had either lacked or deliberately avoided. Where others had been content to catalogue strange events and unusual creatures, Ford sought to understand the underlying principles that made such phenomena possible. His early experiments focused on what he termed the local topology of space-time, measurements designed to map the subtle distortions in reality's fabric that seemed to cluster around certain locations within the town's boundaries. Using instruments of his own design, Ford discovered that gravity falls existed within what physicists call a gravitational anomaly, a region where the normal laws governing matter and energy had been systematically modified by forces that conventional science insisted could not exist. These modifications were not random but followed patterns so complex and purposeful that they suggested conscious design rather than natural occurrence. The distortions seemed to form a kind of multi-dimensional infrastructure, channels and conduits that connected gravity falls to places that existed outside normal space and time. Most intriguingly, this network appeared to be ancient beyond human comprehension, built by intelligence that operated according to principles fundamentally different from human thought. Ford's documentation of these discoveries took the form of detailed journal entries written in notebooks bound in leather that seemed to shift color depending on the angle of observation. His handwriting, already distinctive due to his unusual anatomy, evolved during this period into something that was part scientific notation and part artistic expression, as if the act of recording impossible truths had somehow infected his penmanship with their otherworldly properties. The content of these early entries reveals a mind grappling with revelations that challenged every assumption about the nature of reality he had inherited from his formal education. Ford wrote of discovering creatures that existed partially in multiple dimensions simultaneously, of plants that derived their energy from sources of radiation that did not appear on any known spectrum, and of geological formations that seemed to grow and change according to mathematical principles that suggested conscious manipulation of fundamental physical constants. Yet it was not the individual anomalies that fascinated Ford most deeply, extraordinary though they were. It was the growing realization that all these seemingly disparate phenomena were connected by an underlying logic, a vast and ancient system that operated according to rules so alien that human minds could barely glimpse their true complexity. The key to understanding this system, Ford realized, lay not in the anomalies themselves, but in the symbols and patterns that appeared repeatedly throughout his research. Strange markings carved into stone that was older than the geological record suggested possible, geometric configurations that appeared in crystalline formations and bacterial colonies alike. Most significantly, a recurring motif that seemed to represent some kind of wheel or compass, surrounded by symbols that suggested astronomical or mathematical significance. This symbol, which Ford privately dubbed the Cipher wheel, became the focus of his most intensive investigations. Unlike the random markings and accidental patterns that characterized most of the town's mysterious phenomena, the Cipher wheel appeared to be a deliberate communication, a message left by intelligence vast and alien for purposes that Ford could only begin to guess. The wheel consisted of 10 distinct symbols arranged around a central hub, each symbol seemingly designed to represent some aspect of Gravity Falls' supernatural ecosystem. Ford identified what appeared to be representations of local anomalous species, geographical features significant to the town's mystical geography, and what might have been abstract concepts like time, space, and dimensional barriers. Deciphering the meaning of individual symbols proved to be only the beginning of Ford's challenge. The true complexity of the Cipher wheel lay not in its components but in their relationships, the way the symbols seemed to interact with each other, according to principles that operated simultaneously on mathematical, linguistic, and mystical levels. Ford's attempts to decode these relationships consumed months of intensive study, during which his already minimal contact with the outside world dwindled to almost nothing. He worked 18 and sometimes 20-hour days, sustained by coffee that he brewed strong enough to dissolve metals, and by a growing conviction that he was on the verge of breakthrough that would revolutionize human understanding of reality itself. The isolation that this work required gradually transformed Ford from an eccentric scholar into something approaching a hermit. Residents of Gravity Falls, accustomed though they were to unusual behavior from the academics and artists who periodically took up residence in their community, began to notice Ford's increasing withdrawal from normal social interaction. Shopkeepers reported that he purchased supplies in bulk quantities designed to minimize the frequency of his necessary trips into town. His orders grew increasingly exotic, including materials that most businesses had to special order from suppliers, whose catalogs seemed to specialize in substances that existed on the margins of legality and logic alike. The Postal Service delivered packages addressed to Ford that arrived from institutions and organizations that directory assistants insisted did not exist. Academic journals published in languages that linguists could not identify. Scientific instruments manufactured by companies whose corporate headquarters seemed to exist only as post office boxes in cities that appeared on no reliable maps. More disturbing than Ford's growing isolation was the change that seemed to be occurring in Ford himself. Neighbors who glimpsed him during his rare appearances in public noted that he had developed a habit of talking to himself, carrying on animated conversations with invisible companions who seemed to respond to his questions and comments in ways that suggested actual communication rather than mere delusion. His physical appearance also began to reflect the strain of his intensive research. Weight loss made his naturally tall frame appear almost skeletal, while lack of sleep left his eyes sunken and surrounded by shadows that seemed deeper than mere fatigue could account for. Most unsettling were the small burns and cuts that covered his hands, injuries that he claimed were the inevitable result of working with equipment designed to probe the boundaries of physical law. Those few residents who maintained any kind of regular contact with Ford reported that his conversation had become increasingly difficult to follow, filled with references to concepts and entities that seemed to exist primarily in dimensions of his own devising. He spoke of mathematical theorems that described the behavior of impossible objects, of historical events that had occurred in timelines parallel to but separate from normal human experience, and of philosophical frameworks designed to accommodate truths too large for conventional human consciousness. Yet beneath the growing eccentricity and social withdrawal, Ford's fundamental dedication to rigorous scientific methodology remained intact. His journals from this period reveal not the ravings of a madman, but the careful observations of a researcher whose work had carried him into territories where madness and sanity were simply inadequate categories for describing the human response to ultimate reality. The breakthrough that Ford had been pursuing with such single-minded determination finally occurred during the winter solstice of 1977, though the exact nature of his discovery would not become clear until much later, when the consequences of his success had already begun to reshape the fate of Gravity Falls itself. Working alone in his laboratory during the longest night of the year, Ford achieved what he later described as successful contact with an intelligence that existed beyond the normal boundaries of space and time. The entity that responded to his carefully constructed summoning protocols introduced itself with a name that seemed to shift and change depending on how Ford tried to perceive it, but which eventually stabilized into something that human vocal cords could approximate: Bill Cipher. Bill presented himself as a being of vast knowledge and benevolent intentions, a scholar and explorer from dimensions where the petty limitations that constrained human existence simply did not apply. He claimed to have been observing Ford's research with growing admiration, impressed by the young scientist's willingness to pursue truth regardless of the personal cost or social consequences. The conversations that followed, conducted through methods that Ford described as direct mental interface but which outside observers might have interpreted as elaborate self-delusion, opened vistas of possibility that transformed Ford's understanding not only of gravity falls but of reality itself. Bill revealed that the anomalies Ford had been studying were not random occurrences but were actually the result of systematic intervention by beings who existed in what he termed the nightmare realm, a dimension that served as a kind of backstage area for the theater of normal reality. These beings had been using gravity falls as a testing ground for thousands of years, experimenting with modifications to physical law that might eventually be implemented on a larger scale. More significantly, Bill claimed that Ford had been chosen for a special role in this cosmic experiment. His unusual anatomy, his extraordinary intellectual gifts, and his willingness to pursue forbidden knowledge despite social pressure and personal risk marked him as potentially worthy of partnership in projects that would dwarf any merely human achievement. The partnership that Bill proposed was breathtaking in its scope and ambition. Together, they would construct a machine capable of opening permanent portals between dimensions, allowing for direct communication and eventually physical travel between worlds that had been separated since the beginning of time. Ford would gain access to knowledge and technology beyond his wildest dreams, while Bill and his associates would acquire their first reliable foothold in the physical dimension that humans called home. Ford accepted this partnership with enthusiasm that was tempered only by his scientist's instinct for caution and systematic verification. Even in his excitement at the possibilities Bill described, he insisted on conducting his own independent research into the claims and promises his new ally had made. This research led Ford deeper into the hidden history of gravity falls than any previous investigator had dared to venture. Following clues provided by Bill but verified through his own careful investigation, Ford discovered evidence of dimensional incursions that stretched back to the very founding of the town. The Native Americans who had first settled in the region had not been driven away by conventional warfare or disease, as official histories claimed, but by encounters with entities that had emerged from tears in reality itself. The early European settlers, rather than simply establishing a logging community, had been recruited by forces beyond their understanding to serve as guardians and observers, maintaining a human presence in a location where the barriers between worlds were naturally thin. The Northwest family and their allied conspirators had built their wealth and power not through conventional business ventures, but by serving as brokers and facilitators for trade between dimensions. Most disturbing of all, Ford discovered that several previous researchers had undertaken projects very similar to his own, attempting to establish systematic contact with inhabitants of parallel dimensions. These earlier scholars had achieved varying degrees of success, but their work had invariably ended in disaster, disappearance, or worse fates that the historical record could only hint at in coded language and deliberate omissions. Yet Bill dismissed these historical precedents as the failures of minds too small and timid to grasp the true possibilities of interdimensional collaboration. The previous researchers had lacked Ford's unique combination of intellectual brilliance and anatomical distinction. They had attempted to work alone, without the guidance and protection that Bill could provide. Most importantly, they had approached their research as mere academic exercise, rather than as the foundation for transformation that would benefit both dimensions involved. Under Bill's guidance, Ford began construction of what he termed the Universal Portal, a machine designed to create stable doorways between dimensions that could remain open for extended periods, without the catastrophic instabilities that had plagued earlier attempts at interdimensional engineering. The device incorporated principles that seemed to violate conservation of energy while somehow maintaining perfect thermodynamic balance, drawing power from sources that existed outside normal space-time while producing effects that were measurable using conventional instruments. The portal's construction required nearly 2 years of intensive work, during which Ford's isolation from normal human society became nearly complete. He spoke to no one except Bill, consulted no resources except those his interdimensional partner provided, and pursued no goals except the perfection of technology that would reshape reality itself. The journals Ford kept during this period reveal the gradual evolution of a brilliant mind under pressures that no human consciousness had ever been designed to withstand. His early entries maintain the careful scientific detachment that had characterized his previous research, recording observations and calculations with the precision of a master craftsman, documenting the construction of a particularly complex mechanism. But as the work progressed and Ford's contact with Bill deepened, subtle changes began to appear in both his writing style and his reported thought processes. References to ordinary human concerns gradually disappeared from his entries, replaced by speculation about cosmic forces and interdimensional politics that seemed increasingly divorced from any recognizable human perspective. Most significantly, Ford began to report experiences that suggested his consciousness was becoming somehow entangled with Bill's in ways that transcended normal communication. He described sharing memories that belonged to neither of them individually, accessing knowledge that seemed to emerge from some collective pool of interdimensional awareness, and perceiving reality through sensory modalities that human neurology should not have been capable of supporting. These experiences, rather than alarming Ford as they might have alarmed a more cautious researcher, filled him with excitement and anticipation. He interpreted them as evidence that his work was succeeding beyond his most optimistic projections, that he was literally evolving beyond the limitations of merely human consciousness into something that could exist comfortably in the expanded reality that interdimensional contact would create. The truth, as Ford would eventually discover to his horror and regret, was something far more sinister than evolutionary transcendence. But that revelation lay in the future, hidden behind layers of deception that Bill had spent eons perfecting. For now, in the closing months of 1979, Stanford Pines worked alone in his laboratory, utterly convinced that he was on the verge of achievements that would establish him as one of the greatest scientists in human history. The machine grew day by day under his skilled hands, its impossible geometries taking shape according to blueprints that seemed to exist as much in the realm of pure mathematics as in the physical dimension Ford still thought of as home. Soon, very soon, the universal portal would be complete and the real work could begin. What that real work might involve, and what consequences it might produce for Gravity Falls and the world beyond, were questions that Ford was no longer capable of asking. The answers, when they finally came, would prove more terrible than even his worst nightmares could have conceived. To understand the true nature of Bill Cipher, one must first abandon every comfortable assumption about the nature of existence itself, for Bill represents something that transcends the ordinary categories of being and non-being that define mortal experience. He is not simply an entity from another dimension, though that description contains fragments of truth. He is not merely a powerful spirit or demon, though those terms capture aspects of his terrible reality. Bill Cipher is something far more fundamental and far more dangerous. He is chaos given consciousness, destruction granted intelligence, and malice refined into its purest, and most concentrated form. The dimension from which Bill originated defies description in languages that evolved to describe three-dimensional space and linear time, but those few scholars who have glimpsed its true nature through theoretical mathematics and forbidden vision report a realm where the very concepts of up and down, before and after, self and other, existed only as arbitrary distinctions imposed by consciousness rather than fundamental aspects of reality itself. This was the second dimension, a realm of perfect geometric abstraction, where beings existed as living mathematical concepts, their thoughts and emotions expressed through angles and equations, rather than the crude biochemistry that constrains mortal consciousness. It was a place of infinite potential and zero substance, where ideas could reshape reality simply by being conceived with sufficient clarity and force of will. Bill's existence in this realm was unlike that of his fellow beings, for even in a dimension where the impossible was routine, he stood apart as something exceptional and dangerous. Where other two-dimensional entities were content to exist as stable geometric forms, exploring the infinite possibilities of mathematical relationship and abstract beauty, Bill burned with hungers that his native dimension simply could not satisfy. He was not content to exist as a triangle, no matter how perfect or complex. He yearned to experience sensations that required physical matter, to manipulate substances that possessed weight and texture, to impose his will upon beings who could resist and struggle and suffer in ways that pure mathematical concepts simply could not. Most dangerously of all, Bill possessed the intelligence and determination necessary to transform these yearnings from impossible dreams into achievable goals. The method by which Bill accomplished his escape from the second dimension represents one of the most catastrophic events in the history of existence itself, though the details remain mercifully hidden from most mortal minds. According to the fragments of information that have leaked through dimensional barriers over the eons, Bill discovered a way to weaponize the fundamental instability that underlies all geometric abstraction. By manipulating the mathematical relationships that defined his native reality, Bill created what physicists would call a cascade failure, a breakdown in the logical consistency that held the second dimension together. The realm that had existed for eternity as a perfect expression of mathematical truth began to collapse in upon itself, its infinite planes and angles folding and twisting until they formed structures too complex for rational minds to comprehend. The other inhabitants of the second dimension, those peaceful geometric beings who had done nothing to deserve the fate that Bill's ambition had brought upon them, were consumed in the collapse. Their screams, if screams is an adequate word for the expression of pure mathematical anguish, echo still through the spaces between dimensions, serving as a perpetual reminder of the price that innocence pays when ambition knows no bounds. Bill himself survived the catastrophe he had created, but survival came at a cost that transformed him from a two-dimensional triangle into something that existed between dimensions, in the spaces where reality grew thin and the normal laws of physics held only tentative authority. He became a refugee from his own crimes, a wanderer between worlds seeking a new realm where he could establish the kind of dominion that his nature demanded. The realm he discovered was what beings like himself called the nightmare realm, a dimension that existed in the gaps between more stable realities, sustained by the fears and madness that leak out of inhabited worlds like infection from untended wounds. Here, among beings that were themselves exiles and outcasts from more orderly forms of existence, Bill found not a home but a base of operations from which to plan his eventual conquest of dimensions that still possessed the qualities he had destroyed in his native reality. The nightmare realm was populated by entities that defied easy categorization, beings that had been expelled from their original dimensions for crimes against reality itself, or that had evolved in spaces where the normal rules of existence held no sway. Some appeared as constantly shifting geometric abstractions that hurt to look upon directly. Others took forms that seemed designed specifically to trigger the deepest phobias embedded in mortal consciousness. Among these creatures of chaos and madness, Bill established himself not through physical dominance but through the force of his personality and the breadth of his ambitions. He possessed something that most of his fellow exiles lacked: a clear vision of what he wanted to accomplish, and the strategic intelligence necessary to transform vision into achievable objectives. Bill's goal was nothing less than the conquest of the physical dimensions, those realms where matter and energy existed in stable forms, and where beings possessed the kind of tangible substance that could experience genuine suffering. He did not simply want to visit these dimensions or to establish diplomatic contact with their inhabitants. He wanted to remake them according to his own twisted vision, transforming their orderly realities into extensions of the nightmare realm where chaos and suffering would reign supreme. The challenge that Bill faced in pursuing this goal was the same obstacle that had protected the physical dimensions from conquest by nightmare entities since the beginning of time: the barriers that separated stable reality from the spaces between worlds. These barriers were not mere walls or boundaries, but fundamental aspects of reality's structure, woven into the very fabric of space and time in ways that made them essentially impregnable to direct assault. Generations of nightmare beings had exhausted themselves in futile attempts to break through these dimensional barriers by force, only to discover that the very act of attacking them made them stronger and more resistant to further assault. The barriers seemed to possess a kind of immune system that adapted to each new form of attack, developing countermeasures that made similar attempts progressively less effective. Bill's genius lay in recognizing that these barriers could not be broken from the outside, but might be weakened or circumvented from within. If he could establish communication with beings who existed on the other side of the dimensional walls, he might be able to convince them to create openings that would allow him to slip through where he could not force his way. This insight led Bill to develop what he privately called the partnership strategy, a long-term plan for establishing contact with susceptible individuals in target dimensions and gradually manipulating them into becoming unwitting collaborators in their own conquest. The strategy required patience, subtlety, and a deep understanding of the psychological weaknesses that made mortal beings vulnerable to manipulation by intelligences that operated according to entirely different moral frameworks. Bill's first attempts to implement this strategy met with mixed success. The early targets he selected, while intelligent enough to accomplish the technical tasks he required, often lacked the ambition or the moral flexibility necessary to pursue projects that would ultimately threaten their entire reality. They would begin his assigned tasks with enthusiasm, but would inevitably discover ethical concerns or practical obstacles that caused them to abandon the work before it could reach completion. These failures taught Bill valuable lessons about the selection criteria he needed to apply when choosing potential partners. Intelligence was necessary, but not sufficient. Technical skill was important, but secondary to psychological compatibility. Most crucially, the ideal collaborator needed to possess ambitions large enough to override normal moral constraints and ego sufficient to believe that they could control forces far beyond their understanding. The process by which Bill identified and contacted potential partners represented a masterpiece of interdimensional espionage and psychological manipulation. Unable to manifest directly in target dimensions, he learned to observe potential collaborators through the windows created by their dreams, their moments of deep concentration, and their interactions with phenomena that existed on the borderlines between normal reality and the spaces where nightmare entities could operate. Bill became a student of mortal psychology, with the dedication of a scholar whose life depended upon perfect understanding of his subject matter. He learned to recognize the signs of ambition that had grown beyond ethical boundaries, of intelligence that had become isolated from normal social constraints, and of ego that had expanded to the point where it could no longer accommodate the possibility of failure or limitation. When he identified individuals who met his criteria, Bill would begin the delicate process of establishing contact, initially through what his targets would interpret as inspiration, intuition, or lucky breakthrough in their research. Ideas would occur to them that seemed to emerge from their own brilliance, but that were actually carefully crafted suggestions planted by an intelligence that understood their psychological vulnerabilities with predatory precision. The early stages of each partnership were characterized by mutual benefit and apparent collaboration between equals. Bill would provide his targets with genuine insights and useful information that advanced their legitimate research goals while gradually introducing concepts and methodologies that served his own agenda. The partnership would seem to develop naturally through the meeting of compatible minds rather than through manipulation by a vastly superior intelligence. Only gradually, as the relationship deepened and the target became increasingly dependent upon Bill's guidance and support, would the true nature of the collaboration begin to reveal itself. By the time his partners realized that they were not working with a benevolent interdimensional colleague, but with something that regarded them as tools to be used and discarded, they were typically so deeply invested in their joint projects that withdrawal seemed impossible. Bill's manipulation techniques incorporated not only psychological pressure, but also genuine rewards that made resistance increasingly difficult. Partners who cooperated with his plans would find their research advancing at unprecedented rates, their technical challenges resolving themselves through insights that seemed to emerge from pure inspiration, and their wildest theoretical speculations confirmed through experimental results that defied conventional scientific wisdom. More insidiously, Bill learned to make his partners feel special, chosen, elevated above their merely human colleagues through their participation in projects that transcended normal mortal limitations. He fed their egos with carefully calibrated praise while isolating them from social connections that might provide alternative perspectives on their increasingly dangerous activities. The loneliness that resulted from this isolation made his partners even more dependent upon Bill's companionship and approval. He became not just their research collaborator, but their primary source of intellectual stimulation, emotional support, and social interaction. The prospect of losing this relationship became more terrifying than the risks associated with continuing the work that the relationship demanded. Bill's ultimate goal in these partnerships was always the construction of what he termed liberation devices, machines capable of creating stable portals between dimensions that would allow him and his allies to manifest physically in target realities. The specific design of these devices varied, depending upon the technological capabilities and theoretical frameworks available in each target dimension, but their fundamental purpose remained constant: to provide nightmare entities with the foothold they needed to begin the systematic transformation of ordered reality into extensions of their own chaotic realm. The first successful construction of such a device, accomplished through partnership with a brilliant but tragically naive physicist in a dimension roughly parallel to the one that contains gravity falls, provided Bill with his initial taste of physical manifestation and confirmed the viability of his conquest strategy. The experience of possessing actual substance, of being able to manipulate matter and energy directly rather than through intermediaries, was so intoxicating that it shaped all his subsequent planning and ambition. Yet that first successful manifestation also taught Bill important lessons about the limitations and vulnerabilities that accompanied physical existence. Bodies could be damaged or destroyed in ways that purely mental entities did not need to fear. Physical presence required constant energy expenditure to maintain coherent form. Most significantly, manifestation in ordered reality made nightmare entities partially subject to the laws and limitations that governed that reality, constraining their abilities in ways that existence in the nightmare realm did not. These discoveries led Bill to refine his strategy for subsequent conquest attempts. Rather than seeking immediate and total manifestation, he would focus on establishing multiple small footholds that could be gradually expanded and connected. Each successful portal would make the next one easier to create and maintain. Each dimension successfully infiltrated would provide resources and staging areas for attacks upon adjacent realities. The dimension that contained gravity falls represented a particularly attractive target for several reasons that made it central to Bill's long-term strategic planning. The natural weakness in dimensional barriers that characterized the location meant that portals created there would be unusually stable and require less energy to maintain. The town's history of supernatural phenomena would make the manifestation of nightmare entities less likely to attract unwanted attention from authorities or skeptical investigators. Most importantly, Gravity Falls had produced a series of brilliant researchers whose work had brought them to the very edge of breakthrough discoveries in interdimensional physics. Each generation seemed to produce at least one individual whose combination of intellectual gifts and psychological vulnerabilities made them ideal candidates for the kind of partnership that Bill specialized in creating and exploiting. The researcher who would ultimately provide Bill with his greatest opportunity was Stanford Pines, whose unique anatomy and exceptional intelligence made him potentially the most valuable collaborator in Bill's long history of interdimensional manipulation. Ford's six-fingered hands were not simply a genetic curiosity, but a sign that his physical form had been subtly modified by prolonged exposure to dimensional energies, making him naturally compatible with technologies that operated according to interdimensional principles. More significantly, Ford's personality contained the perfect combination of ambition and isolation that Bill had learned to recognize and exploit. His intellectual arrogance made him susceptible to flattery about his superior understanding of cosmic truths. His social isolation made him desperate for the kind of companionship that only an entity of Bill's knowledge and apparent sophistication could provide. His scientific training gave him the technical skills necessary to construct the complex machinery that Bill's plans required. When Bill first made contact with Ford during that winter solstice night in 1977, he knew immediately that he had found the perfect partner for his most ambitious conquest attempt yet. Ford possessed all the qualities that previous collaborators had lacked, combined with access to a location where dimensional barriers were naturally weak and where portal construction would face minimal interference from skeptical authorities. The relationship that developed between Bill and Ford represented the culmination of eons of planning and preparation, the final implementation of strategies that had been refined through countless previous attempts in dimensions scattered throughout the multiverse. Bill approached this partnership with confidence born of vast experience and patient observation, certain that he had finally found the combination of factors necessary to achieve the total victory that had eluded him for so long. Yet even Bill, for all his intelligence and experience, could not have anticipated every factor that would influence the outcome of his carefully laid plans. The very qualities that made Ford such a valuable collaborator also contained the seeds of potential resistance that could, under the right circumstances, transform the relationship from partnership into opposition. Ford's scientific training, while making him capable of understanding and implementing Bill's technical requirements, also instilled in him habits of verification and skeptical inquiry that could potentially uncover the deceptions upon which their collaboration was founded. His isolation, while making him dependent upon Bill's companionship, also protected him from social pressures that might have prevented him from taking decisive action if he ever recognized the true nature of their relationship. Most dangerously, from Bill's perspective, Ford's ego and ambition, while making him willing to pursue projects that more cautious individuals would avoid, also made him unlikely to accept a subordinate role once he fully understood the implications of their joint work. The same pride that made Ford such an effective collaborator could potentially transform him into an implacable enemy if he ever realized how completely he had been manipulated. These potential complications lay in the future, hidden behind layers of deception and misdirection that Bill had spent years perfecting. For now, in the early stages of their partnership, Ford remained completely convinced that he was engaged in collaborative research with a benevolent, interdimensional entity whose goals perfectly aligned with his own scientific ambitions. The truth, as Ford would eventually discover to his horror, was that Bill's Cipher was neither benevolent, nor collaborative, nor even entirely sane by any standard that rational beings would recognize. He was something far more dangerous than a mere conqueror or destroyer. He was an entity whose very existence represented the antithesis of everything that made life meaningful, whose ultimate goal was not simply to rule reality, but to transform it into something that could no longer sustain hope, love, beauty, or any other quality that distinguished existence from mere survival. The machine that Ford was building under Bill's guidance would, if completed and activated, open doorways not to realms of infinite possibility and expanded knowledge, but to dimensions of chaos and suffering that would make the worst human nightmares seem like pleasant dreams by comparison. The partnership that Ford believed would establish him among the greatest scientists in history would instead make him responsible for catastrophe beyond imagination, the destruction of everything he had ever claimed to value or protect. But these revelations lay hidden in the future, concealed behind Bill's carefully constructed facade of friendship and mutual benefit. The demon who had destroyed his own dimension and sought to destroy countless others continued his patient work of corruption and manipulation, secure in his conviction that this time, finally, his plans would achieve the total success that had eluded him for so long. The countdown toward catastrophe had begun, measured not in days or months, but in the gradual erosion of Ford's capacity for independent thought and moral judgment. With each passing moment, Bill's influence grew stronger, while Ford's ability to recognize and resist that influence grew correspondingly weaker. Soon, very soon, the universal portal would be complete, and the real nightmare could begin. The 3 journals that Stanford Pines created during his years of isolation in Gravity Falls represent far more than mere scientific documentation or personal memoir. They are artifacts of a mind grappling with truths too vast for human consciousness to safely contain. Repositories of knowledge so dangerous that Ford himself eventually recognized the necessity of fragmenting and hiding them to prevent their misuse by those who lacked the wisdom or moral foundation necessary to handle such power responsibly. Each journal was bound in leather that seemed to shift its hue depending upon the angle of observation and the quality of light that fell upon it, as if the very material from which they were crafted had been touched by the same otherworldly forces that their pages sought to catalogue and understand. The covers bore symbols that Ford had discovered carved into the deepest caves beneath Gravity Falls, markings so ancient that they seemed to predate not only human civilization, but the geological processes that had shaped the continent itself. The first journal, marked with the symbol of a hand bearing 6 fingers, contained Ford's initial documentation of Gravity Falls' supernatural phenomena during the period when he still believed himself to be conducting objective scientific research. Its pages, filled with meticulous sketches and careful observations recorded in Ford's distinctive handwriting, chronicle his discovery of creatures and anomalies that defied every principle of biology, physics, and common sense that his formal education had taught him to consider inviolable. Here were detailed anatomical studies of beings that seemed to exist partially in multiple dimensions simultaneously, their physical forms shifting and changing according to principles that Ford could observe but not yet fully understand. He documented creatures that fed upon emotions rather than conventional matter, plants that derived their energy from temporal distortions rather than sunlight, and geological formations that grew and changed according to mathematical principles that suggested conscious manipulation of fundamental physical constants. The early entries in Journal 1 reveal a mind still grounded in conventional scientific methodology, approaching each new discovery with the systematic rigor that had characterized Ford's academic career. He recorded measurements with precision, documented behavioral patterns with patience, and attempted to develop theoretical frameworks that could accommodate phenomena that mainstream science insisted were impossible. Yet even these early pages contain subtle signs of the transformation, that Ford's exposure to Gravity Falls' mysteries was beginning to work upon his consciousness. His sketches, while maintaining their technical accuracy, began to incorporate artistic flourishes that seemed to emerge from intuition rather than observation. His descriptions, while preserving their scientific objectivity, gradually acquired a poetic quality that suggested deep emotional engagement with subjects that conventional research protocols insisted should be approached with detached neutrality. Most significantly, the margins of Journal 1 began to fill with notes and symbols that seemed to exist in a different category from the main text. These marginalia, written in inks that appeared to shift color depending upon the reader's state of mind, contained references to concepts and entities that Ford's conscious mind had not yet encountered, but which seemed to emerge from some deeper level of awareness that his research was gradually awakening. The second journal, bearing the symbol of a pine tree that seemed to cast shadows in directions that defied the geometry of normal space, documented Ford's growing obsession with the underlying patterns that connected Gravity Falls' disparate anomalies into a coherent system. Where Journal 1 had focused upon individual phenomena, Journal 2 attempted to map the relationships and connections that bound these seemingly random occurrences into something that resembled purposeful design. Ford's investigations during this period led him deeper into the hidden history of Gravity Falls than any previous researcher had dared to venture. Following clues that seemed to emerge from dreams as much as from waking observation, he discovered evidence of dimensional incursions that stretched back to the very founding of the region. Ancient petroglyphs hidden in caves that official geological surveys claimed did not exist told stories of beings that had walked between worlds when the barriers separating realities were thinner than spider silk. The Native American peoples who had first settled in the region, Ford realized, had not simply been driven away by conventional warfare or European diseases. They had fled from encounters with entities that emerged from tears in reality itself, beings whose very presence warped the natural order in ways that made normal human life impossible to sustain. The early European settlers, rather than simply establishing a logging community in convenient proximity to valuable timber resources, had been recruited by forces beyond their understanding to serve as guardians and observers. Their role was to maintain human presence in a location where the barriers between dimensions were naturally weak, ensuring that the gradual thinning of reality's fabric proceeded according to some vast and alien plan. Journal 2 contained Ford's documentation of this hidden history, but it also began to reveal the true scope of the forces that were manipulating events in Gravity Falls. The symbols and patterns that he had initially interpreted as random anomalies were revealed to be components of a vast machine, a mechanism that operated according to principles that transcended normal human understanding of cause and effect. The key to understanding this mechanism, Ford realized, was the recurring motif that he had begun to think of as the Cipher wheel. This symbol, which appeared in contexts separated by thousands of years and vast geographical distances, seemed to represent some kind of map or blueprint for the transformation of reality itself. Ford's attempts to decode the Cipher wheel filled hundreds of pages in Journal 2, each page representing hours of intensive analysis that pushed his intellectual capabilities to their absolute limits. The wheel consisted of 10 distinct symbols arranged around a central hub, each symbol appearing to represent some aspect of Gravity Falls' supernatural ecosystem. Some of the symbols were relatively straightforward to interpret, representing creatures or phenomena that Ford had already documented in his research. The pine tree clearly referenced the anomalous forest that surrounded the town, where trees grew in patterns that defied botanical classification, and wildlife displayed intelligence far beyond what natural selection should have produced. Other symbols proved more challenging to decode, representing abstract concepts or entities that existed primarily in dimensions beyond normal human perception. The symbol that resembled a question mark seemed to represent knowledge itself, or perhaps the dangerous curiosity that drove beings like Ford to pursue truths that were too vast for mortal consciousness to safely contain. Most mysterious of all was the symbol at the center of the wheel, a shape that seemed to shift and change depending upon the angle from which it was viewed and the state of mind of the observer. Ford spent months attempting to capture this central symbol accurately, only to discover that each attempt produced a slightly different result, as if the symbol itself was somehow aware of being observed and was deliberately frustrating his efforts to pin down its true nature. The third journal, marked with a symbol that hurt to look upon directly and seemed to exist partially outside normal space, contained Ford's documentation of his partnership with Bill Cipher and the construction of the Universal Portal. These pages, written during the period when Ford's isolation from normal human society was most complete, reveal a mind that had been transformed by exposure to truths too large for conventional consciousness to accommodate. The handwriting in Journal 3 was noticeably different from that in the earlier volumes, not merely in its increased illegibility, but in its fundamental character. Where Ford's earlier entries had been written by a hand guided by human intelligence and human purposes, these later pages seemed to be the product of something that was only partially human, consciousness that had been modified by prolonged contact with entities that operated according to entirely different principles. The technical diagrams that filled Journal 3 represented engineering concepts that seemed to violate basic principles of physics, while somehow maintaining internal logical consistency. The portal that Ford was constructing under Bill's guidance incorporated technologies that drew power from sources that existed outside normal space-time, manipulated matter and energy according to principles that conventional science insisted were impossible, and created effects that could only be described using mathematical frameworks that Ford had apparently developed independently of any known theoretical tradition. Yet the most disturbing aspect of Journal 3 was not its technical content but its emotional tone. Where the earlier journals had maintained at least the facade of objective scientific documentation, these pages revealed a researcher whose capacity for independent judgment had been gradually eroded by prolonged exposure to an intelligence vast and alien. Ford's descriptions of his partnership with Bill grew increasingly rhapsodic as the work progressed, filled with language that suggested not collaboration between equals but worship of a superior being. He wrote of Bill's wisdom with the fervor of a religious convert, of their joint project with the enthusiasm of someone who believed himself to be participating in the most important work ever undertaken by human hands. More disturbing still were the passages where Ford seemed to lose track of his own identity, writing in voices that belonged neither to him nor to Bill, but to some hybrid consciousness that had emerged from their increasingly intimate collaboration. These sections, often written in languages that linguists would later determine bore no relationship to any known human linguistic tradition, suggested that the partnership was transforming Ford in ways that went far beyond mere psychological influence. The margins of Journal 3 were filled with symbols and diagrams that seemed to exist in a constant state of flux, their shapes shifting and changing even as they were being observed. These marginalia, written in inks that appeared to be composed of something other than conventional matter, contained information that Ford's conscious mind had apparently recorded without fully understanding its significance or implications. Hidden within the technical specifications and construction diagrams were warnings, messages that Ford had apparently embedded in the journal's pages during moments of clarity when his true situation became temporarily visible to him. These warnings, written in codes that only someone with Ford's exact combination of knowledge and desperation could have devised, spoke of deception and manipulation, of partnership that was actually enslavement, and of a project that would bring catastrophe rather than enlightenment. The invisible ink that Ford used for these hidden messages was not a conventional chemical compound, but something far stranger, a substance that became visible only when exposed to specific combinations of temperature, electromagnetic radiation, and what Ford cryptically described as properly focused human intention. The process by which these messages could be revealed required knowledge that Ford had carefully scattered throughout all 3 journals, ensuring that only someone who had studied his complete work would be able to access the warnings he had hidden within it. The cipher systems that Ford employed throughout his documentation evolved in complexity as his research progressed and his understanding of the forces he was dealing with deepened. The early ciphers were relatively simple substitution codes, the kind of puzzles that any determined cryptographer could solve, given sufficient time and patience. These served primarily to protect sensitive information from casual observation while remaining accessible to serious researchers who might need to continue Ford's work. But as Ford's partnership with Bill developed, and his awareness of the true stakes involved in his research grew, his encryption methods became correspondingly more sophisticated. The later ciphers incorporated not only mathematical principles, but also elements that seemed to draw upon the same interdimensional forces that his research was investigating. These advanced ciphers could not be solved through conventional cryptographic methods but required what Ford termed dimensional resonance, a process by which the decoder had to achieve psychological and spiritual alignment with the consciousness that had created the encrypted message. This alignment was dangerous in the extreme, requiring the decoder to open their mind to influences that could permanently alter their perception of reality and their capacity for independent thought. The most complex cipher system appeared in the final pages of Journal 3, where Ford had attempted to record information so dangerous that conventional encryption was insufficient to contain it. This ultra-cipher incorporated elements of pure mathematics, interdimensional linguistics, and what Ford described as psychic encryption, creating messages that could only be decoded by minds that had been specifically prepared through exposure to the same forces that had shaped Ford's consciousness during his partnership with Bill. The decryption process for these ultimate secrets required not only intellectual analysis, but also spiritual preparation that bordered on the mystical. The decoder had to achieve a state of consciousness that Ford termed dimensional awareness, a condition that allowed perception of realities that existed beyond the normal boundaries of human experience, but that also carried the risk of permanent psychological damage or worse fates that Ford could only hint at in his most cryptic warnings. Throughout all three journals, Ford had incorporated cross-references and interconnected clues that linked apparently unrelated observations and discoveries into patterns of meaning that became visible only when all three volumes were studied together. Individual entries that seemed to contain straightforward documentation of specific phenomena were revealed, when combined with references scattered throughout the other journals, to be components of larger arguments about the nature of reality itself. The deliberate separation and hiding of the three journals represented Ford's final act of responsibility as a scientist and as a human being concerned for the welfare of his species. As his partnership with Bill approached its climax and the completion of the universal portal drew near, Ford experienced moments of clarity during which he recognized the true nature of the forces he had been serving and the magnitude of the catastrophe that their success would bring upon the world. Unable to abandon the project that had consumed years of his life and that represented the culmination of everything he had worked toward, but equally unable to continue in good conscience, Ford chose a middle path that reflected both his scientific dedication and his moral awakening. He would complete the technical work that his partnership with Bill required, but he would also create safeguards that could potentially prevent the misuse of the knowledge and technology he was developing. The separation of the journals was designed to ensure that no single individual could access the complete technical specifications necessary to reconstruct the universal portal, or to fully understand the theoretical principles that made such construction possible. Each journal contained crucial information, but that information was useless without the corresponding data contained in the other volumes. More importantly, the separation forced anyone seeking to utilize Ford's research to make a conscious choice about the risks they were willing to accept. The warnings and safeguards that Ford had embedded in his documentation became increasingly explicit as the danger level of the information increased, ensuring that anyone who gained access to the most dangerous knowledge would do so only after being repeatedly warned about the potential consequences of their actions. The hiding places that Ford selected for the three journals were chosen not merely for their security, but for their symbolic significance within the supernatural ecology of Gravity Falls. Each location represented one aspect of the forces that Ford had spent years studying, creating a kind of mystical geography that reflected the deeper patterns of meaning that connected all of his research into a coherent whole. Journal 1 was hidden in a place associated with the natural world, reflecting Ford's early focus on cataloging and understanding the anomalous creatures and phenomena that populated Gravity Falls. Journal 2 found its resting place in a location connected to human history and culture, appropriate for a volume that documented the hidden past and secret purposes that had shaped the town's development. Journal 3, containing the most dangerous information and the most explicit warnings, was concealed in a place that existed at the intersection of multiple realities, where the barriers between dimensions grew thin enough to permit glimpses of the cosmic forces that Ford's research had revealed. The specific creatures and phenomena, catalogued throughout the three journals, represented only the visible surface of a vast ecosystem of anomalous life that existed in the spaces between normal reality and the nightmare dimensions that Bill and his allies called home. Ford's documentation reveals a complex hierarchy of entities, from relatively harmless curiosities that posed little threat to human observers, to cosmic horrors whose very existence challenged the fundamental assumptions upon which human sanity depended. At the lowest level of this hierarchy were creatures that Ford classified as dimensional refugees, beings that had been displaced from their native realities by cosmic catastrophes or interdimensional warfare. These entities, while often possessing abilities that defied normal scientific understanding, were essentially benign in their intentions toward human observers. They sought only to exist peacefully in whatever corner of reality they could find, asking nothing more than to be left alone to pursue their alien forms of life and happiness. More challenging to catalogue were the entities that Ford termed reality parasites, beings that fed upon the fundamental forces that held ordered existence together. These creatures did not intend harm to human beings or to the physical world in general, but their very presence gradually weakened the barriers that separated stable reality from the chaos that existed beyond its borders. Most dangerous of all were the entities that Ford hesitantly classified as nightmare nobility, beings like Bill's Cipher that possessed not only vast power, but also the intelligence and malicious intent necessary to use that power for purposes that no sane mind would consider acceptable. These entities sought not merely to exist within ordered reality, but to reshape it according to their own twisted visions, transforming worlds of meaning and beauty into playgrounds of chaos and suffering. The journals contain detailed instructions for recognizing and, when possible, defending against each category of anomalous entity. Ford had developed protective techniques that combined scientific methodology with principles borrowed from the mystical traditions of cultures that had learned to coexist with supernatural forces. These defenses ranged from technological devices that could detect interdimensional intrusion to psychological exercises designed to strengthen human consciousness against influences that sought to corrupt or control it. Yet Ford's most important contribution to the defense of human civilization was not any specific technique or device, but rather the comprehensive documentation that the journals represented. By creating a complete record of his discoveries and experiences, Ford ensured that future researchers would not have to rediscover the basic principles of interdimensional science through their own dangerous experimentation. The knowledge contained within the 3 journals was sufficient to establish an entirely new field of scientific inquiry, one that could potentially revolutionize human understanding of reality itself, while providing practical tools for defending against threats that mainstream science refused to acknowledge. Yet that same knowledge, in the wrong hands or applied without proper safeguards, could also serve as a roadmap for catastrophes that would make Ford's own mistakes seem trivial by comparison. The journals thus represented both humanity's greatest hope for understanding and defending itself against cosmic forces beyond mortal comprehension, and its greatest vulnerability to individuals whose ambition exceeded their wisdom, or whose moral foundations were insufficient to withstand the temptations that such power inevitably brought. Hidden within leather covers that seemed to shift between dimensions, written in inks that responded to the reader's state of consciousness, protected by ciphers that required spiritual as well as intellectual preparation to decode, the 3 journals of Stanford Pines waited in their scattered hiding places for the moment when they would be needed once again. That moment, when it finally arrived, would test not only the courage and intelligence of those who discovered them, but also their capacity for wisdom, compassion, and moral judgment in the face of truths too vast for human consciousness to safely contain. The universal portal that Stanford Pines constructed in the hidden basement laboratory beneath his Gravity Falls research facility represents one of the most ambitious and dangerous technological achievements in the history of human civilization. A machine whose very existence challenged the fundamental assumptions about reality that had governed scientific inquiry since the dawn of rational thought. Yet the portal was more than simply an advanced piece of engineering, for its construction required not only technical mastery, but also a willingness to abandon the moral and ethical constraints that had traditionally limited human exploration of the universe's deepest mysteries. The machine itself defied easy description, its form incorporating geometric principles that seemed to exist partially outside normal three-dimensional space, while drawing upon energy sources that conventional physics insisted could not exist. The primary structure consisted of a triangular archway nearly 30 feet in height, its frame constructed from materials that Ford had synthesized using techniques provided by Cipher, substances that maintained perfect structural integrity, despite possessing properties that violated several fundamental laws of thermodynamics. The archway's surface was covered with symbols and circuits that seemed to exist in a constant state of flux, their patterns shifting and changing according to principles that Ford's conscious mind could observe but never fully comprehend. These markings were not merely decorative but served as components of a control system so complex that its operation required direct mental interface with intelligences that existed beyond the normal boundaries of human consciousness. Within the triangular frame, when the portal was activated, would appear a window into spaces that existed between dimensions, realms where the normal laws of cause and effect held only tentative authority, and where beings of unimaginable power waited for the opportunity to extend their influence into realities that had previously been beyond their reach. The view through this window would show not the orderly cosmos that human astronomy had mapped and catalogued, but the true universe that lay hidden behind the comfortable illusions that protected mortal minds from truths too vast for sanity to accommodate. The construction of such a device required not only advanced theoretical knowledge but also access to materials and energy sources that existed outside the normal boundaries of terrestrial science. Cipher's guidance proved invaluable in obtaining these resources, though the methods by which they were acquired remained mysterious even to Ford, who had learned not to question too closely the source of gifts that advanced his research so dramatically. Some materials seemed to arrive through what Ford privately termed temporal displacement, appearing in his laboratory as if they had been transported backward through time from some future era when human technology had advanced far beyond its current limitations. Other components materialized through what appeared to be direct matter conversion, as if Bill possessed the ability to transform ordinary substances into exotic materials by manipulating their fundamental atomic structure through sheer force of will. Most disturbing were the materials that Ford suspected had been transported across dimensional boundaries from realities where the laws of physics operated according to entirely different principles. These substances exhibited properties that defied every theoretical framework that human science had developed. Yet they proved essential for the portal's construction, serving functions that no earthly material could possibly fulfill. The energy requirements for the portal's operation exceeded anything that conventional power generation could provide, necessitating the construction of auxiliary systems that drew power from sources that existed outside normal space-time. Ford's initial calculations suggested that activating the portal would require energy equivalent to several nuclear power plants operating at full capacity for extended periods, a requirement that would have made the project impossible using conventional technological approaches. Bill's solution to this energy crisis involved the construction of what he termed resonance amplifiers, devices that could tap into the fundamental vibrations that underlied all existence and convert those vibrations into usable power. These amplifiers operated according to principles that Ford found intellectually fascinating but emotionally disturbing, for they seemed to draw their energy from the suffering and chaos that existed throughout the multiverse. Each amplifier was tuned to detect and harvest specific frequencies of pain, fear, despair, and madness that emanated from dimensions where such emotions had achieved physical reality. The more intense the suffering in these source dimensions, the the more power the amplifiers could generate, creating a system that literally fed upon the anguish of beings that Ford would never meet, but whose torment his research was helping to perpetuate. Ford's growing awareness of these ethical implications created one of the first serious conflicts in his relationship with Bill Cipher. Though the demon's manipulation techniques proved sophisticated enough to minimize the threat that Ford's moral concerns posed to their collaboration, Bill dismissed Ford's worries as the product of limited human perspective, arguing that the suffering harvested by the resonance amplifiers was inevitable regardless of whether it was put to constructive use. More persuasively, Bill pointed out that the Portal project would ultimately benefit not only Ford's dimension, but also the realms from which the amplifiers drew their power. Once dimensional barriers had been permanently lowered and free communication established between realities, Bill explained, the advanced civilizations that would emerge from this contact could work together to eliminate the sources of suffering that the amplifiers currently harvested. This argument proved particularly effective because it appealed to Ford's genuine desire to use his knowledge for the betterment of all existence rather than merely for personal advancement. The vision that Bill painted of interdimensional cooperation, leading to the elimination of pain and death throughout the multiverse, was so compelling that Ford found himself willing to overlook the immediate ethical costs of achieving such a magnificent goal. The construction process itself took nearly 2 years of intensive work, during which Ford's isolation from normal human society became almost complete. The technical challenges were so demanding that they required Ford's complete attention for 18 and sometimes 20 hours per day, leaving little time for sleep, and none at all for social interaction with anyone other than Bill. The complexity of the portal's design meant that each component had to be crafted with precision that exceeded anything achievable through conventional manufacturing processes. Ford found himself learning entirely new forms of metallurgy and crystallography, techniques that incorporated not only advanced scientific principles but also elements that resembled the mystical practices of ancient alchemists and natural philosophers. Many of the portal's most crucial components required what Ford came to think of as consciousness-assisted fabrication, manufacturing processes that could only succeed when guided by minds that had achieved specific states of awareness through meditation, sensory deprivation, and other techniques that Bill claimed were necessary for interfacing with the dimensional forces that the portal would ultimately harness. These altered states of consciousness, while necessary for the work, also made Ford increasingly susceptible to Bill's influence and manipulation. During the extended periods when his awareness was modified to accommodate the portal's construction requirements, Ford found his normal capacity for independent thought and critical analysis significantly diminished, leaving him vulnerable to suggestions and instructions that he might have questioned under ordinary circumstances. The gradual erosion of Ford's psychological autonomy was so subtle that he remained unaware of it throughout most of the construction period. He attributed his increasing dependence upon Bill's guidance to the technical complexity of their joint project rather than to deliberate manipulation, interpreting his growing inability to function independently as evidence of the work's unprecedented difficulty rather than as a sign that his consciousness was being systematically compromised. Bill encouraged this interpretation by providing Ford with genuine technical insights and problem-solving assistance that advanced the portal's construction in ways that Ford's unassisted efforts could never have achieved. The demon's help was so valuable and apparently beneficial that Ford found it impossible to imagine completing the project without continued collaboration, a dependence that Bill carefully nurtured and exploited throughout their partnership. The portal's activation sequence, when Bill finally revealed its details to Ford, proved to be even more complex than the construction process itself. Bringing the machine online required not only technical procedures, but also what Bill termed dimensional alignment, a process by which the portal's operator had to achieve psychological resonance with the forces that would be channeled through the device. This alignment process involved opening the operator's consciousness to influences from the nightmare dimensions that the portal was designed to access, a procedure that Bill claimed was perfectly safe when performed under proper guidance, but which Ford's growing scientific knowledge suggested might be extraordinarily dangerous for anyone whose mental preparation was insufficient to withstand exposure to cosmic forces beyond mortal comprehension. Bill assured Ford that his years of preparation and his ongoing partnership with an experienced interdimensional entity had provided him with all the protection necessary to safely operate the portal once construction was complete. The demon's confidence was so complete and his explanations so technically sophisticated that Ford found his lingering concerns easy to dismiss as the product of insufficient understanding rather than legitimate caution. The final months of construction were marked by a series of increasingly dramatic tests as individual components of the portal were brought online, and their interactions with the dimensional forces they were designed to channel were carefully evaluated. These preliminary activations produced effects that confirmed both the portal's technical viability and the magnitude of the forces that its full operation would unleash. Even at partial power levels, the portal generated distortions in local space-time that were detectable using conventional scientific instruments. Gravity fluctuations strong enough to affect the behavior of pendulum clocks throughout Gravity Falls became routine occurrences during testing periods. Electromagnetic anomalies disrupted radio and television reception across the entire region, while temperature variations that defied meteorological explanation created localized weather patterns that persisted for days after each test was completed. More disturbing were the reports from local residents of increased supernatural activity during the periods when portal testing was most intensive. Sightings of anomalous creatures increased dramatically, while ordinary animals began displaying behaviors that suggested heightened anxiety or fear. Most significantly, several residents reported experiencing unusually vivid dreams that seemed to involve places and beings that bore no relationship to their normal life experiences. Ford recognized these phenomena as evidence that the portal's influence was beginning to extend beyond his laboratory and affect the broader supernatural ecosystem of Gravity Falls. Rather than viewing these effects as warning signs that his work might be endangering innocent people, Ford interpreted them as confirmation that the portal was successfully interacting with the dimensional forces it had been designed to harness. Bill reinforced this interpretation by explaining that the preliminary effects Ford was observing were simply the natural result of dimensional barriers beginning to thin in preparation for the portal's full activation. The increased supernatural activity and the strange dreams experienced by local residents were signs that consciousness throughout the region was beginning to adapt to the expanded reality that interdimensional contact would create. These explanations satisfied Ford's scientific curiosity while allowing him to avoid confronting the ethical implications of continuing work that was clearly affecting people who had never consented to participate in his experiments. His growing isolation and his increasing dependence upon Bill's guidance made it easier to rationalize away concerns that a more independent perspective might have found impossible to dismiss. The relationship between Ford and his twin brother Stanley became an early casualty of the Portal Project's demands upon Ford's time and attention. The brothers had maintained sporadic contact during Ford's early years in Gravity Falls, but as the portal construction intensified and Ford's isolation deepened, their communication dwindled to virtually nothing. Stanley's attempts to maintain their relationship were frustrated by Ford's increasing inability to discuss his work in terms that someone without advanced scientific training could understand. The gulf between Ford's expanding knowledge and Stanley's conventional worldview grew so wide that meaningful conversation between them became nearly impossible, even when Ford made genuine efforts to bridge the gap. More problematically, Ford's growing paranoia about protecting the secrets of his research made him reluctant to share any details about his life in Gravity Falls with family members who might inadvertently reveal sensitive information to parties who could misuse it. This secrecy, while perhaps justified from a security standpoint, created emotional distance that strained the twins' relationship beyond its ability to survive intact. The final rupture between the brothers occurred during Stanley's unexpected visit to Gravity Falls in the late autumn of 1981, when Ford's portal was nearing completion and his partnership with Bill had reached a stage where the demon's true nature was beginning to reveal itself in ways that even Ford's compromised judgment could no longer completely ignore. Stanley's arrival coincided with a period when Ford was experiencing increasing doubts about the wisdom of proceeding with the portal's activation, doubts that Bill was working frantically to suppress through intensified manipulation and psychological pressure. The presence of someone from Ford's pre-Gravity Falls life, someone whose perspective had not been shaped by years of exposure to supernatural phenomena and interdimensional influences, provided Ford with a brief opportunity to see his situation from an outside viewpoint. The confrontation that resulted from Stanley's recognition that his brother was involved in something far more dangerous than legitimate scientific research created the catalyst for Ford's final awakening to the true nature of his partnership with Bill Cipher. For the first time in years, Ford found himself forced to explain and justify his actions to someone whose moral framework had not been compromised by prolonged exposure to cosmic forces that operated according to alien ethical systems. Stanley's horrified reaction to Ford's description of the Portal Project and its intended effects provided Ford with a mirror in which he could finally see the full magnitude of what he had been manipulated into creating. The machine that he had believed would usher in a new age of interdimensional cooperation and universal enlightenment was revealed, through Stanley's uncompromised perspective, to be a weapon of unimaginable destructive potential. The realization that he had spent years serving as Bill Cipher's unwitting accomplice in a plan to destroy the dimensional barriers that protected reality from chaos and madness triggered a psychological crisis that shattered Ford's remaining illusions about their partnership. The demon's carefully constructed facade of benevolence and mutual benefit collapsed under the weight of evidence that Ford could no longer ignore or rationalize away. Bill's response to Ford's awakening was swift and merciless, revealing aspects of the demon's true nature that he had kept carefully hidden throughout their collaboration. The entity that Ford had believed to be a benevolent interdimensional scholar was exposed as something far more sinister, a being whose ultimate goal was not enlightenment but domination, not cooperation but conquest. The psychological warfare that followed Ford's rebellion against Bill's influence represented one of the most intense battles between human will and supernatural manipulation in recorded history. Bill's techniques for controlling and corrupting mortal consciousness had been refined across eons of experience, while Ford possessed only his native intelligence and his belated recognition of the trap he had fallen into. The demon's assault upon Ford's sanity incorporated not only direct psychological pressure, but also manipulation of the physical environment around him. The portal itself became a weapon in this conflict, its partially activated state allowing Bill to manifest disturbing phenomena that were designed to drive Ford to madness or despair rather than to kill him outright. Ford's survival of this assault required not only extraordinary mental resilience, but also the application of protective techniques that he improvised from half-remembered fragments of mystical lore and scientific theory. His success in resisting Bill's final manipulation attempts represented a triumph of human will over supernatural coercion that would have seemed impossible to anyone who understood the true magnitude of the forces involved. Yet Ford's victory came at a terrible cost, for his rebellion against Bill's influence triggered the activation sequence for the portal itself, creating dimensional rifts that began to weaken the barriers between realities throughout the Gravity Falls region. The machine that Ford had built to serve Bill's purposes continued to operate according to its original programming even after its creator had recognized the catastrophic nature of its intended function. The 30-year period during which the portal remained active but uncontrolled represented one of the most dangerous epochs in Gravity Falls' long history of supernatural crises. The dimensional rifts created by the machine's operation allowed increasing numbers of entities from the nightmare dimensions to slip through into normal reality, while the gradual weakening of dimensional barriers made the entire region increasingly unstable and dangerous. Stanley's accidental activation of the portal's final sequence, years after Ford's disappearance into the dimensional spaces beyond normal reality, brought this period of mounting crisis to its climax. The machine's completion of its original programming finally opened the stable interdimensional gateway that Bill Cipher had spent decades planning to create, providing the nightmare entities with the foothold they had sought for so long. Yet the portal's activation also created the opportunity for Ford's return from his exile in dimensions beyond normal space and time, bringing with him knowledge and experience that would prove crucial for humanity's ultimate defense against the forces that his own work had helped to unleash upon the world. The machine that had been built to serve as a weapon against reality itself would ultimately become the instrument through which that reality could be defended, though the price of that defense would prove higher than anyone could have imagined when the portal's construction first began, in the hidden laboratories beneath Gravity Falls. The event that residents of Gravity Falls would come to call Weirdmageddon began not with the dramatic flourish that apocalyptic prophecies traditionally describe, but with something far more insidious and terrifying: the gradual realization that reality itself had become negotiable, that the fundamental laws which governed existence had been suspended by forces that regarded human concepts of order and meaning as quaint limitations to be discarded at will. The initial manifestation occurred during the final moments of summer, when the dimensional barriers that Stanford Pine's portal had been systematically weakening for 3 decades finally collapsed, entirely under the weight of Bill Cipher's concentrated malice and ambition. The demon who had spent eons plotting his escape from the nightmare dimensions between realities achieved his ultimate goal not through conquest or destruction, but through a far more elegant solution. He simply convinced reality to change its mind about what was possible. The transformation began in the deep woods surrounding Gravity Falls, where ancient trees that had stood for centuries suddenly found themselves rearranged according to geometric principles that belonged more to fever dreams than to any botanical classification system. Massive Douglas firs and towering pines twisted themselves into impossible spirals that reached toward a sky that had forgotten how to maintain a consistent color, while the very ground beneath them rippled and flowed like water, carrying boulders and fallen logs in patterns that defied every law of physics that human science had ever formulated. Wildlife throughout the region underwent changes that transformed them from ordinary forest creatures into living embodiments of chaos and impossibility. Deer sprouted additional limbs that emerged from anatomically impossible locations, while their antlers grew into fractal patterns that seemed to extend partially into dimensions that human eyes could not properly perceive. Bears developed the ability to phase in and out of existence at will, appearing solid one moment and translucent the next, as if they were uncertain about their own reality and had decided to hedge their bets by existing in multiple states simultaneously. The birds that had once filled the forest with familiar songs began to communicate in languages that seemed to bypass the human auditory system entirely, their calls reaching directly into the minds of anyone unfortunate enough to hear them, and planting concepts and images that belonged to realities where sanity was considered a form of mental illness. Flocks of these transformed creatures wrote messages in the sky through their flight patterns, symbols and equations that hurt to look upon directly, but which conveyed truths about the nature of existence that most minds were not equipped to safely process. Even the insects underwent metamorphoses that challenged the basic assumptions about what living creatures could be or do. Butterflies developed wings that displayed moving pictures of events occurring in parallel dimensions, while ants began constructing geometric structures that violated the fundamental principles of engineering yet somehow remained perfectly stable despite their impossible architecture. Bees produced honey that tasted of memories that belonged to people who had never existed, while spiders wove webs from materialized mathematics that could trap abstract concepts as easily as they ensnared ordinary flies. The town of Gravity Falls itself experienced transformations that made the changes in the surrounding forest seem mild by comparison. Buildings that had stood for generations suddenly found themselves rearranged according to principles that treated architectural logic as merely one option among many. The town hall appeared upside down one morning, its foundations somehow supporting the entire structure despite being located above the roof, while the library rotated slowly through dimensions that allowed visitors to access books that had been written in realities where human literature had developed along entirely different evolutionary paths. Residential neighborhoods became landscapes of impossible geometry, where houses existed inside other houses while simultaneously containing themselves, creating recursive loops of domestic space that could trap unwary visitors in endless cycles of rooms that led only to more rooms. Mailboxes delivered letters from senders who lived in parallel timelines, while telephone lines carried conversations between residents and alternate versions of themselves who had made different life choices and were now eager to compare notes on the relative merits of their respective realities. The commercial district transformed into a bazaar of the impossible, where shops sold goods that existed in theoretical states until the moment of purchase, when they would collapse into specific realities based upon the buyer's expectations and desires. The Mystery Shack, that monument to tourist trap entrepreneurship, became a fortress of relative normalcy in a world where normal had become the most exotic state of existence imaginable, its walls somehow maintaining their structural integrity, while everything around them succumbed to the logic of dreams and nightmares. Streets and sidewalks developed the ability to change their destinations based upon the intentions of travelers, leading pedestrians to locations that existed only as long as someone was actively traveling toward them. Traffic lights began displaying colors that had no names in any human language, but which conveyed emotional states so intense that they could alter the mood of entire city blocks. Street signs pointed toward places like Yesterday's Tomorrow and The Sound of Purple, while their text shifted and changed depending upon the reading comprehension level and psychological state of whoever was attempting to interpret them. The transformation extended beyond the merely physical into realms that challenged the fundamental categories through which human consciousness attempted to organize experience. Time itself became fluid and negotiable, flowing backward in some locations while pooling in stagnant eddies elsewhere, creating temporal anomalies where cause and effect became matters of opinion rather than absolute principles. Residents found themselves aging in reverse during certain hours of the day, growing younger as morning progressed into afternoon before snapping back to their original ages when evening arrived. Others experienced temporal displacement that allowed them to have conversations with past or future versions of themselves, creating paradoxes that somehow failed to destroy the universe, only because the universe had temporarily forgotten that paradoxes were supposed to be problematic. Memory became unreliable in ways that went far beyond ordinary forgetfulness, with residents discovering that they possessed recollections of events that had never occurred alongside gaps in their recall of experiences that they were certain had happened. Some people found themselves remembering alternate versions of their own lives with such clarity that they began to question which set of memories represented their actual past, while others developed the ability to selectively edit their recollections in real time, removing unpleasant experiences and replacing them with improved versions that felt completely authentic. The concept of identity itself became fluid as the barriers between individual consciousness began to break down under the pressure of Bill Cipher's influence. Residents occasionally found themselves experiencing the world through their neighbors' sensory systems, while their own thoughts and emotions became accessible to others in ways that made privacy a meaningless concept. Some individuals discovered that they could temporarily merge their consciousness with that of family members or friends, creating hybrid personalities that possessed the combined knowledge and abilities of both participants. Most disturbing of all were the changes that occurred in the realm of causality, where the relationship between actions and consequences became subject to negotiation rather than natural law. Residents found that they could sometimes achieve desired outcomes simply by believing strongly enough that those outcomes should occur, while other actions that should have produced predictable results instead generated effects that seemed to be chosen at random from an infinite catalogue of possibilities. The local newspaper began printing stories about events that were scheduled to happen tomorrow, while yesterday's headlines described occurrences that everyone remembered differently. Weather forecasts became exercises in creative writing, predicting precipitation of solid geometry or partly cloudy with a chance of existential dread. The radio stations broadcast music that had been composed in dimensions where sound operated according to different mathematical principles, creating auditory experiences that could not be reproduced using instruments designed for normal reality. Bill Cipher himself appeared throughout Gravity Falls as a living embodiment of controlled chaos, his triangular form manifesting wherever his presence would cause the maximum amount of delightful confusion and terror. Unlike the random transformations that characterized most of Weirdmageddon's effects, Bill's appearances were precisely calculated to achieve specific psychological and practical objectives in his campaign to reshape reality according to his own twisted vision. The demon's manifestations took forms that were simultaneously magnificent and horrifying, combining the geometric perfection that characterized his true nature with flourishes designed to appeal to human aesthetic sensibilities while simultaneously violating them in ways that caused profound discomfort. His voice, when he chose to communicate through audible speech rather than direct mental contact, carried harmonics that seemed to resonate in dimensions beyond the normal acoustic spectrum, creating effects that listeners felt in their bones and dreams as much as they heard with their ears. Bill's interactions with Gravity Falls residents during this period revealed aspects of his personality that had remained hidden during his partnership with Stanford Pines, displaying a sadistic playfulness that treated human suffering as entertainment and mortal terror as the highest form of art. He would appear without warning to individuals going about their daily routines, offering to grant their deepest desires in exchange for participation in games whose rules he would explain only after the participants had already agreed to play. These games invariably involved challenges that were technically possible to complete, but which required participants to abandon fundamental aspects of their humanity in order to succeed. A businessman desperate for financial security might be offered unlimited wealth in exchange for surrendering his capacity for empathy, while a lonely individual seeking companionship could gain the friendship of everyone in town by agreeing to forget the names and faces of everyone he had ever loved. The demon's offers were always carefully calibrated to exploit the specific psychological vulnerabilities of each individual, presenting temptations that were simultaneously attractive and repulsive, impossible to accept and difficult to refuse. Those who agreed to participate in Bill's games found themselves transformed in ways that granted them their stated desires while ensuring that the fulfillment of those desires brought only misery and regret. Yet Bill's activities during Weirdmageddon extended far beyond individual manipulation into realm of large-scale reality engineering that threatened to make the changes he had already wrought permanent features of existence itself. Working from a base of operations that he had established in what had once been the town's central park, but which now existed as a pocket of pure geometric abstraction floating several hundred feet above the ground, Bill began implementing modifications to the fundamental structure of local spacetime that would eventually extend his influence far beyond the boundaries of Gravity Falls. The floating geometric fortress that served as Bill's headquarters defied architectural classification, its form shifting constantly between configurations that seemed designed by intelligences operating according to entirely different aesthetic principles. The structure incorporated elements of classical geometry, combined with impossible angles that created spaces larger inside than outside, rooms that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, and corridors that led to destinations determined by the psychological state of whoever was traveling through them. From this vantage point, Bill could observe and manipulate events throughout Gravity Falls, while remaining safely isolated from any potential interference from residents who might attempt to organize resistance against his rule. The fortress also served as a broadcasting station from which he transmitted the reality modifications that gradually expanded his influence beyond the immediate vicinity of the town into surrounding regions where the effects of Weirdmageddon had not yet taken hold. These transmissions took the form of what Bill termed reality viruses, self-replicating patterns of impossibility that could infect normal space-time and gradually transform it according to the same principles that had already reshaped Gravity Falls. Each virus was designed to target specific aspects of ordered existence, systematically breaking down the logical consistency that allowed rational beings to navigate their environment and make meaningful decisions about their lives and futures. The spread of these reality viruses followed patterns that combined the infectious dynamics of biological diseases with the propagation characteristics of information systems, creating hybrid phenomena that could travel through both physical space and mental networks. Individuals who had been exposed to Weirdmageddon effects became carriers who could transmit reality distortions to others through ordinary social interactions, while ideas and concepts contaminated by Bill's influence could spread through communication networks to infect minds that had never been directly exposed to supernatural phenomena. The only factor that prevented this contamination from spreading beyond the Pacific Northwest during the initial phases of Weirdmageddon was the natural resistance that stable realities possessed against modifications that violated their fundamental organizing principles. The reality viruses that Bill had created were highly effective within the already destabilized environment of Gravity Falls, but they lost potency rapidly when they encountered regions where the dimensional barriers remained intact and the laws of physics continued to operate according to their normal parameters. Yet Bill's strategic planning had anticipated this limitation, and his activities during Weirdmageddon included systematic efforts to weaken the dimensional barriers throughout an ever-expanding radius around Gravity Falls. Working through intermediaries and remote influence techniques, he began establishing secondary infection sites in major population centers, where reality viruses could take hold and begin the process of local destabilization that would eventually allow for direct intervention by nightmare entities. The resistance to Bill's reality reshaping campaign emerged gradually from the most unlikely sources, beginning not with organized opposition from governmental or military authorities, but with individual acts of defiance by ordinary residents who refused to accept that chaos and impossibility represented improvements over the admittedly flawed but nevertheless meaningful existence they had known. Before Weirdmageddon began, these early acts of resistance were small in scale, but significant in their symbolic importance, representing the assertion of human values and human will against forces that regarded both as irrelevant obstacles to cosmic entertainment. A shopkeeper continued to operate his business according to normal commercial principles, despite being offered the ability to transform his merchandise into anything his customers desired. A teacher maintained her classroom schedule and lesson plans, even though her students had developed the ability to absorb knowledge directly through telepathic contact. Most importantly, family relationships and friendships continued to function according to principles of loyalty and affection that Bill's reality modifications could not successfully corrupt or eliminate. Parents continued to protect their children even when those children had been transformed into beings that existed partially in multiple dimensions. Spouses maintained their commitments to each other, despite being offered opportunities to experience perfect relationships with idealized partners created from pure imagination. These demonstrations of human resilience and moral consistency created focal points of stability within the chaos of Weirdmageddon, small islands of meaningful existence that served as gathering places for individuals who retained enough of their original personalities to recognize the difference between authentic experience and the elaborate illusions that Bill was offering as substitutes for genuine life. The formation of an organized resistance movement began when these scattered individuals discovered that their combined will and determination could actually reverse some of the reality modifications that Bill had implemented throughout. Gravity Falls. Working together, groups of residents found that they could restore small areas to normal operational principles, creating safe zones where conventional physics operated and where human consciousness could function without being constantly assaulted by impossibilities and paradoxes. These restoration efforts required not only cooperation and mutual support, but also the application of principles that combined scientific methodology with what could only be described as applied faith, the belief that reality should operate according to logical and moral principles, rather than the whims of cosmic entertainers. The success of these early restoration projects provided the resistance with both practical victories and the psychological foundation necessary to contemplate larger-scale efforts to oppose Bill's transformation of their world. The ultimate confrontation between the forces of chaos and the defenders of meaningful existence would center around the ancient prophecy encoded in the Cipher wheel, that mysterious symbol which Ford had discovered during his early research, and which Bill himself had apparently been aware of throughout his long campaign to gain access to the physical dimensions. The Cipher wheel represented more than simply a map or blueprint for containing supernatural threats. It was a description of the relationships and cooperation necessary to maintain the boundaries between order and chaos, a guide to the forms of unity and sacrifice that could preserve the possibility of meaningful existence in the face of forces that sought to transform everything into raw material for cosmic games. The 10 symbols arranged around the wheel's circumference. Each represented not only specific individuals or phenomena, but also the aspects of human experience that gave life meaning and purpose. The wheel as a whole described a form of cooperation that transcended individual differences and personal ambitions, creating collective strength that could resist corruption by entities that operated according to entirely alien value systems. The activation of the Cipher Wheel's protective power would require the voluntary participation of individuals who embodied each of the 10 symbolic positions, their willingness to subordinate their personal desires and fears to the larger goal of preserving reality itself. This cooperation would need to be genuine and freely given, rather than coerced or manipulated, for the wheel's power derived from authentic human connection, rather than from external, magical, or technological sources. The gathering of the wheel's required participants represented one of the most challenging aspects of organizing effective resistance to Weirdmageddon, for it required individuals who had been scattered and traumatized by reality modifications to overcome their differences and work together toward goals that none of them could achieve independently. The process demanded not only courage and determination, but also the kind of wisdom and compassion that could recognize shared humanity even in beings who had been transformed by exposure to cosmic forces beyond normal comprehension. Yet the most difficult sacrifice that the Cipher Wheel's activation would require was not the cooperation of the 10 symbolic participants, but the willingness of those who loved them to risk losing them forever. The power necessary to contain Bill Cipher and reverse the effects of Weirdmageddon could only be channeled through individuals who were prepared to give up everything they valued, including their own identities and memories, to protect a world that many of them would not survive to enjoy. The final battle between human will and cosmic chaos would be fought not with weapons or technology, but with the fundamental choice between meaning and meaninglessness, between existence that acknowledged moral and logical constraints, and existence that recognized only power and entertainment as guiding principles. The outcome would determine not only the fate of Gravity Falls and its residents, but also the future of reality itself. The question of whether ordered existence could maintain itself against forces that regarded order as nothing more than a temporary arrangement of materials that could be rearranged at will for aesthetic or recreational purposes. In the end, the price of victory would prove higher than anyone had anticipated, requiring sacrifices that challenged the very values that made victory worthwhile, transformations that saved the world by fundamentally altering the people who loved it enough to risk everything for its preservation. The restoration of reality following Weirdmageddon did not occur with the clean completeness that fairy tales and heroic legends typically describe, where evil is vanquished and the world returns instantly to its previous state of innocent normalcy. Instead, the process resembled the slow healing of a wound so deep that it had altered the fundamental nature of the tissue it had torn, leaving scars and changes that would persist long after the immediate crisis had passed, and the most obvious symptoms had been addressed through courage and sacrifice. In the immediate aftermath of Bill Cipher's defeat and banishment, Gravity Falls found itself in a state that could best be described as cautious normalcy, where the basic laws of physics had been restored to their conventional operations, but where traces of the reality modifications that had characterized Weirdmageddon continued to manifest in subtle ways that reminded residents daily of how Close Their World had come to permanent transformation into something unrecognizable and alien. The most obvious remnant of the chaos that had briefly ruled the town was the memory wipe that had been necessary to contain the psychological trauma of residents who had witnessed impossibilities that their minds were not equipped to process safely. This selective amnesia, while preventing the kind of mass psychological breakdown that exposure to cosmic horror typically produces, created its own complications. As people struggled to understand gaps in their recollection and to reconcile their vague impressions of recent events with the conventional explanations that had been carefully constructed to fill the void, where truth had become too dangerous to remember. Yet the memory modifications that had been applied to most of Gravity Falls' population were not comprehensive enough to eliminate every trace of what had occurred during those terrible days when reality itself had become négociable. Fragments of impossible experiences continued to surface in dreams and half-remembered moments, creating a persistent sense of unease that manifested as increased anxiety, sleep disturbances, and a general feeling among residents that their familiar world had somehow become slightly alien and unpredictable. Children proved particularly resistant to the memory modifications, their developing consciousness apparently more flexible and adaptable than adult minds when it came to processing experiences that violated conventional logic. While they could not articulate what they had witnessed in terms that adults could understand or accept, their play activities and artistic expressions continued to incorporate elements that clearly derived from exposure to phenomena that officially had never occurred. Drawings created by elementary school students featured geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly and architectural structures that violated basic principles of engineering while somehow appearing perfectly stable. Games played in schoolyards incorporated rules that seemed to change spontaneously during play, creating activities that resembled the reality modifications of Weirdmageddon more than any conventional childhood entertainment. Most disturbing were the imaginary friends that many children developed following the crisis. Invisible companions who seemed to possess knowledge of events and places that no normal child should have been able to describe. Parents and teachers, lacking their own clear memories of what had transpired, were left to wonder whether these elaborate fantasy relationships represented normal childhood creativity or something more troubling that they were not equipped to understand or address appropriately. The physical environment of Gravity Falls retained more obvious traces of the supernatural catastrophe that had temporarily transformed it into a playground for cosmic horror. While the most dramatic alterations had been reversed when reality reasserted its traditional operational principles, subtle changes persisted throughout the region in forms that were easy to dismiss as natural variation, but which careful observation revealed to be systematic modifications that followed patterns too complex for coincidence to explain. Trees throughout the forests surrounding the town displayed growth patterns that differed subtly from anything recorded in botanical literature, their branches arranged according to mathematical principles that created fractal patterns visible only from specific viewing angles and under particular lighting conditions. These formations appeared completely normal to casual observers, but produced optical effects that could induce mild disorientation in individuals who studied them too closely or for extended periods. Rock formations showed similar anomalies, with stone arrangements that created acoustic effects, allowing sounds to travel between distant locations through underground channels that geological surveys insisted should not exist. Hikers and campers reported hearing conversations and music from sources that could not be located, while their own voices sometimes carried much farther than the surrounding terrain should have permitted, reaching listeners miles away who received the sounds with perfect clarity despite the intervening obstacles. The town's architecture retained evidence of the structural modifications that had occurred during Weirdmageddon, though these changes were sufficiently subtle that most residents attributed them to normal settling and weathering rather than to supernatural intervention. Buildings that had been twisted into impossible configurations and then restored to conventional geometry retained internal spaces that were slightly larger than their external dimensions should have accommodated, creating storage areas and hidden rooms that property owners discovered months or years after the crisis had ended. More significantly, the dimensional barriers that had been systematically weakened during Bill Cipher's campaign to gain access to the physical world never fully recovered their original strength and stability. While they had been reinforced sufficiently to prevent another catastrophic breach, like the one that had enabled Weirdmageddon, they remained permanently altered in ways that allowed for increased supernatural activity throughout the Gravity Falls region. This increased permeability manifested primarily through what researchers would later classify as low-level anomalous phenomena, supernatural occurrences that were strange enough to be noteworthy, but not dangerous enough to pose immediate threats to human safety or sanity. Residents began reporting encounters with creatures that seemed to exist primarily in peripheral vision, beings that could be glimpsed clearly only when not looked at directly, and which vanished completely when examined with focused attention. Electronic devices throughout the town developed quirks and malfunctions that followed patterns, suggesting intelligence rather than random mechanical failure. Television sets occasionally displayed programs that were not being broadcast by any identifiable source, featuring content that seemed to have been produced in locations and time periods that bore no relationship to contemporary reality. Radio receivers picked up transmissions in languages that linguists could not identify, broadcasting music and conversations that created emotional responses disproportionate to their apparent content. Telephone systems began carrying voices and messages that originated from sources that telephone company records insisted did not exist. Residents received calls from numbers that had never been assigned to active lines. Conversations with speakers who claimed to be calling from places that could not be located on any map. Most disturbing were the calls that seemed to come from alternate versions of the recipients themselves, parallel dimension conversations with people who shared their names and memories, but whose life experiences had diverged in subtle but significant ways. The natural wildlife of the region showed similar evidence of permanent modification by their exposure to the reality distortions that had characterized Weirdmageddon. While animals had largely returned to conventional appearance and behavior, they retained enhanced intelligence and awareness that made them capable of complex problem-solving and social organization that exceeded anything that mainstream zoology recognized as normal for their species. Deer began displaying coordinated group behaviors that suggested sophisticated communication systems, organizing themselves into formations that served no apparent survival purpose, but which created geometric patterns visible from aerial observation. Bears developed tool use capabilities that allowed them to manipulate their environment in ways that required abstract planning and conceptual thinking far beyond what conventional animal psychology attributed to their species. Most remarkably, many animals seemed to retain partial memory of the events that had transformed them during the supernatural crisis, displaying behaviors that suggested awareness of threats and possibilities that existed beyond normal sensory perception. They avoided certain areas where dimensional barriers remained particularly weak, while showing unusual interest in locations where beneficial supernatural phenomena were most likely to occur. The bird populations of Gravity Falls developed particularly sophisticated responses to the region's altered supernatural environment, with different species apparently specializing in monitoring and responding to different types of anomalous activity. Crows gathered in unusual numbers whenever interdimensional phenomena were about to manifest, while songbirds fell silent in areas where reality distortions were strongest. Domestic animals showed similar adaptations to their changed environment, displaying protective behaviors toward their human companions that suggested awareness of supernatural threats that the humans themselves could no longer consciously perceive. Dogs refused to enter certain buildings or travel specific routes that appeared perfectly safe to their owners but which the animals somehow recognized as dangerous. Cats developed the habit of staring fixedly at empty spaces where sensitive individuals reported feeling observed by invisible presences. The economic and social structures of Gravity Falls adapted to these persistent, anomalous conditions with the same pragmatic flexibility that had allowed the community to function during previous encounters with supernatural phenomena. Businesses learned to account for the unreliability of electronic systems and the occasional appearance of customers who paid with currency from parallel dimensions where the local government had made different decisions about monetary, policy, and national symbols. The tourism industry experienced a renaissance as word spread through networks of paranormal enthusiasts about the increased supernatural activity in the region. However, the town's long-established culture of selective attention and plausible deniability meant that these visitors typically found only enough evidence of anomalous phenomena to fuel speculation without ever encountering anything dramatic enough to provide definitive proof of supernatural activity. Local law enforcement developed informal protocols for dealing with reports of impossible crimes and supernatural disturbances, creating response procedures that addressed residents' concerns while avoiding official documentation that might attract unwanted attention from federal agencies or academic researchers. Sheriff's deputies learned to investigate cases involving theft by invisible perpetrators, vandalism committed by entities that existed only on Tuesdays, and domestic disputes where one party claimed that the other had been replaced by an alternate dimension duplicate. The educational system incorporated subtle modifications to curriculum and teaching methods that helped students develop the mental flexibility necessary to function effectively in an environment where conventional logic was only intermittently reliable, while avoiding explicit instruction in supernatural phenomena. Teachers emphasized critical thinking skills, adaptability, and the importance of maintaining multiple working hypotheses when confronting unusual situations. Advanced students who demonstrated particular aptitude for theoretical thinking and abstract problem solving were quietly provided with access to supplementary materials that prepared them for possible careers in fields that required understanding of anomalous phenomena. These educational tracks, while never officially acknowledged in school district documentation, produced graduates who went on to work for government agencies, private research institutions, and international organizations that specialized in monitoring and responding to supernatural threats. The medical community in Gravity Falls developed similar informal specializations, with healthcare providers learning to diagnose and treat conditions that resulted from exposure to reality distortions and interdimensional radiation. While maintaining conventional medical practices for ordinary health issues, local physicians accumulated expertise in addressing symptoms that mainstream medicine did not recognize as legitimate medical conditions. Patients presented with complaints of temporal displacement syndrome, manifesting as chronic confusion about what day or year they were experiencing. Others suffered from dimensional vertigo, a condition characterized by the persistent sensation of existing simultaneously in multiple realities. Most challenging were cases of memory fragmentation disorder, where individuals retained partial recollections of events that had been officially erased from their consciousness, but which continued to influence their emotional and behavioral responses to seemingly ordinary situations. The network of support groups and informal counseling services that developed to address these post-Weirdmageddon psychological challenges represented one of the most remarkable aspects of the community's adaptation to its altered circumstances. Residents who could not discuss their experiences with outsiders found solace in sharing their confusion and anxiety with neighbors who faced similar challenges in reconciling their fragmented memories with their current reality. These gatherings, typically disguised as book clubs, hobby groups, or recreational activities, provided safe spaces where participants could acknowledge their awareness that something fundamental had changed in their world without risking the social stigma or professional consequences that explicit discussion of supernatural phenomena might have produced. The healing that occurred through these connections often proved more effective than conventional therapy, in helping individuals develop coping strategies for living with partial memories of impossible experiences. Religious communities throughout Gravity Falls underwent their own process of adaptation and theological reflection as members struggled to integrate their half-remembered encounters with cosmic forces into existing spiritual frameworks. Some congregations developed more mystical and contemplative approaches to worship, acknowledging the presence of mysteries that transcended human understanding while avoiding specific references to the supernatural events that had triggered this spiritual evolution. Other religious groups found renewed appreciation for traditional doctrines about the reality of spiritual warfare and the existence of forces beyond normal human perception, interpreting their vague memories of Weirdmageddon as confirmation of ancient teachings about the ongoing struggle between good and evil in realms that exist beyond material reality. Most significantly, the crisis had created a shared sense of community resilience and mutual support that transcended the religious, cultural, and economic differences that had previously divided the town's population into separate social groups. The experience of facing an existential threat that could only be overcome through cooperation and sacrifice had forged bonds of trust and interdependence that continued to strengthen the social fabric long after the immediate crisis had passed. The scientific and academic community that had been attracted to Gravity Falls by its reputation for anomalous phenomena found itself in the paradoxical position of studying supernatural activity that had simultaneously increased in frequency and become more difficult to document reliably. The reality modifications that persisted after Weirdmageddon seemed to be specifically designed to frustrate conventional research methodologies while providing just enough evidence to maintain scientific interest in the region. Researchers discovered that anomalous phenomena would manifest reliably for local residents who were not actively trying to study them, while disappearing or becoming unreliable whenever subjected to systematic observation using standard scientific protocols. This pattern suggested that the supernatural elements of Gravity Falls' environment possessed some form of awareness or intelligence that allowed them to distinguish between casual encounters and deliberate investigation. The few scientists who achieved any success in documenting post-Weirdmageddon phenomena were those who learned to approach their research with the same blend of systematic observation and intuitive understanding that characterized the town's long-established culture of supernatural accommodation. These researchers developed methodologies that incorporated elements of anthropological fieldwork, participant observation, and what could only be described as applied empathy in their attempts to understand anomalous activity that seemed to respond as much to the researchers' intentions and emotional state as to their technical procedures. The journals and research notes that Stanford Pines had created during his pre-Weirdmageddon investigations remained the most comprehensive guide to understanding and interacting safely with the supernatural phenomena that continued to characterize the Gravity Falls region. However, access to these materials was carefully controlled by individuals who understood the dangers that improper use of such knowledge could create. The three journals had been reunited following the crisis, but were maintained as a single collection rather than being separated again. Their combined information serving as a reference resource for situations where conventional approaches to problem-solving proved inadequate. The Cipher systems that Ford had developed to protect his most dangerous discoveries continued to serve their intended function, ensuring that access to the most hazardous information required not only intellectual capability, but also the moral maturity necessary to handle such power responsibly. New entries were occasionally added to the journals by individuals who encountered anomalous phenomena that Ford's original research had not documented, creating an evolving record of supernatural activity that adapted to the changed conditions that had resulted from Weirdmageddon. These editions followed the same careful documentation standards and protective cipher systems that characterized Ford's original work, maintaining the journal's function as both research tools and safety measures. The knowledge, preservation, and transmission systems that had developed around the journals represented perhaps the most sophisticated approach to managing dangerous information that any human community had ever devised. Rather than attempting to suppress or destroy knowledge that could be misused, the system ensured that such information remained available to individuals who demonstrated both the competence to use it effectively and the wisdom to recognize when it should not be used at all. As the months and years following Weirdmageddon accumulated into a new normal for Gravity Falls, the community's adaptation to its altered circumstances became a model for how human societies might learn to coexist with supernatural forces that could not be eliminated or controlled through conventional means. The town's success in maintaining both safety and functionality while accommodating persistent anomalous activity demonstrated possibilities for human development that mainstream civilization had never seriously considered. Yet this success came with costs that extended beyond the immediate sacrifices that had been necessary to end the reality crisis itself. The persistent need for vigilance and adaptation, the constant awareness that conventional assumptions about reality might prove inadequate at any moment, created psychological pressures that affected residents in ways that would take generations to fully understand. The children who grew up in post-Weirdmageddon Gravity Falls would possess capabilities and perspectives that distinguished them fundamentally from individuals raised in more conventional environments, but the long-term implications of these differences remained unknown. Whether these adaptations represented evolutionary advancement or psychological damage would become clear only as these individuals matured and attempted to function in a wider world that had not shared their community's unique experiences. The Cipher legacy that Bill Cipher had inadvertently created through his assault on reality thus extended far beyond the immediate supernatural phenomena that continued to characterize Gravity Falls. The crisis had demonstrated both the vulnerability and the resilience of human consciousness when confronted with forces that operated according to principles fundamentally alien to normal experience, providing insights into the nature of reality and the possibilities for human adaptation that would influence human development in ways that were only beginning to become apparent. The mysteries that endured in the aftermath of Weirdmageddon were not merely unsolved puzzles waiting for adequate investigation, but fundamental questions about the nature of existence itself, challenges that would require new forms of understanding that transcended the traditional boundaries between science and philosophy, between rational analysis and intuitive wisdom, between individual consciousness and collective knowledge. In learning to live with these enduring mysteries, the residents of Gravity Falls had discovered something that might prove to be humanity's most important survival skill: the ability to find meaning and purpose in a universe that was far stranger, far more dangerous, and far more wonderful than any of their ancestors had dared to imagine. Beyond the immediate mysteries that Gravity Falls had learned to accommodate in the aftermath of Weirdmageddon lay questions so fundamental and far-reaching that they challenged not only human understanding of the local anomalies, the entire framework through which consciousness itself attempts to comprehend the nature of existence. These were mysteries that transcended the boundaries of any single location or phenomenon, reaching into the deepest structures of reality to touch upon truths that might reshape humanity's understanding of its place in a cosmos far stranger and more interconnected than any previous generation had dared to imagine. The gravitational anomaly that had given Gravity Falls its name represented only the most obvious manifestation of forces that operated according to principles extending far beyond the conventional physics that human science had developed, to describe the behavior of matter and energy in normal space-time. The town existed within what theoretical physicists would eventually recognize as a nexus point, a location where the fundamental constants that governed reality intersected in ways that created conditions found nowhere else in the known universe. The most profound implication of these discoveries was the suggestion that consciousness itself might be a fundamental force of nature, comparable in importance to gravity, electromagnetism, and the nuclear forces that conventional physics recognized as the basic building blocks of material existence. This possibility challenged the mechanistic worldview that had dominated scientific thinking for centuries, proposing instead a participatory universe where the act of observation and the quality of awareness possessed the power to influence the phenomena being observed. The evidence for this consciousness-reality interaction was particularly strong in cases involving the prophecies and predictions that had played such crucial roles in the events surrounding Weirdmageddon. The accuracy of these prophetic visions could not be explained through conventional models of causation, which insisted that future events could not influence present conditions except through the mediation of physical signals that traveled at or below the speed of light. Yet the prophecies associated with gravity falls had demonstrated knowledge of future events with a specificity and reliability that suggested access to information that existed outside the normal temporal sequence. The Cipher wheel prophecy in particular had provided detailed instructions for actions that could only be meaningful in response to events that had not yet occurred when the prophecy was created. implying that time itself might be far more complex and interconnected than linear models suggested. The investigation of these temporal anomalies led researchers into territory where physics merged with philosophy and metaphysics, raising questions about the fundamental nature of time, causation, and the relationship between past, present, and future. Some theories proposed that consciousness possessed the ability to perceive multiple potential timelines simultaneously, with prophetic visions representing awareness of probable futures that could be altered through appropriate action in the present moment. Other frameworks suggested that time itself might be an emergent property of consciousness rather than a fundamental aspect of reality, with the apparent sequence of cause and effect representing the way awareness organized experience rather than reflecting the true structure of existence. These theories implied that sufficiently expanded consciousness might be capable of perceiving and influencing events across vast spans of time and space, creating possibilities for intervention and guidance that transcended the limitations of ordinary human perception. The role of symbolic systems and cipher codes in facilitating these expanded forms of awareness represented another frontier of investigation that challenged conventional understanding of how information could be transmitted, processed. The effectiveness of the cipher systems developed by Ford and utilized by other researchers suggested that symbolic representations possessed properties that went beyond their function as conventional communication tools. The symbols themselves seemed to act as focal points for consciousness, creating resonance effects that allowed minds to access levels of awareness normally beyond their reach. The process of decoding these symbols required not only intellectual analysis but also intuitive understanding, suggesting that meaning itself might be a fundamental property of reality rather than simply a human construct imposed upon neutral phenomena. The mathematical relationships embedded within the most complex cipher systems displayed properties that connected them to the deepest structures of theoretical physics, incorporating principles from quantum mechanics, relativity theory, and advanced topology in ways that implied understanding of natural laws that human science had not yet discovered. These connections suggested that the beings who created such systems possessed knowledge of reality's fundamental architecture that exceeded anything achieved through conventional scientific methodology. Most intriguingly, the symbolic systems showed evidence of self-organizing and evolutionary properties, with individual symbols and cipher patterns appearing to develop new meanings and capabilities over time through their interaction with conscious observers. This suggested that the act of interpretation and understanding might actually alter the nature of the information being processed, creating feedback loops between consciousness and symbolic systems that generated new forms of knowledge through the very process of attempting to decode existing information. The implications of these discoveries extended far beyond the specific mysteries of gravity falls into questions about the nature of communication, understanding, and knowledge itself. If symbols and ideas possessed the ability to evolve and adapt through their interaction with consciousness, then the boundary between subjective interpretation and objective truth became far more complex and permeable than conventional epistemology acknowledged. The investigation of interdimensional phenomena revealed similar challenges to established frameworks for understanding reality and knowledge. The existence of parallel dimensions and alternate realities, while confirmed through direct experience during Weirdmageddon, raised fundamental questions about the nature of existence that philosophy and physics were only beginning to address adequately. The multiverse theories that emerged from these investigations suggested that reality consisted of an infinite number of parallel dimensions, each representing different possible outcomes of the choices and events that shaped the development of existence. This framework implied that every decision, no matter how trivial it might seem, created branching points where reality divided into multiple paths, each exploring different possibilities for how events might unfold. The beings like Bill Cipher, who moved freely between these dimensions, appeared to possess awareness of the full spectrum of possibilities that existed across all realities, giving them knowledge and perspective that transcended the limitations of existence within any single dimensional framework. Their ability to perceive and influence events across multiple realities simultaneously explained both their tremendous power and their alien perspective on concepts like morality, meaning, and the value of individual existence. Yet, the interaction between dimensions seemed to be governed by principles that prevented unlimited intervention by beings from one reality into the affairs of another. The barriers that separated dimensions appeared to serve protective functions, ensuring that each reality could develop according to its own internal logic without being overwhelmed by influences from incompatible dimensional frameworks. The temporary breakdown of these barriers during Weirdmageddon had demonstrated both the creative and destructive potential that could result from unrestricted interdimensional contact, while the merging of realities had produced unprecedented opportunities for growth and transformation. It had also created conditions that threatened to dissolve the coherent patterns of meaning and purpose that made individual existence valuable and sustainable. The restoration of dimensional barriers following Bill's defeat had preserved the integrity of local reality, but it had also created new questions about the optimal relationship between different dimensional frameworks. Complete isolation seemed to limit the potential for growth and development, while unrestricted contact threatened to destroy the distinctive characteristics that made each reality unique and valuable. The ongoing low-level interdimensional activity that continued in Gravity Falls represented an attempt to find a middle ground between these extremes, maintaining enough permeability to allow for beneficial exchange while preserving enough separation to protect local reality's essential characteristics. This delicate balance required constant monitoring and occasional intervention to prevent minor dimensional intrusions from escalating into major reality crises. The beings responsible for maintaining this balance remained largely invisible and unknown, their activities detectable only through their effects on local supernatural phenomena. These entities appeared to operate according to principles that prioritized the preservation of meaningful existence over the maximization of power or knowledge, suggesting the existence of cosmic ethical frameworks that transcended the value systems of any individual species or civilization. The investigation of these cosmic governance systems revealed hints of vast organizational structures that spanned multiple dimensions and operated across timescales that dwarfed human historical experience. These structures seemed to be dedicated to maintaining the conditions necessary for consciousness to develop and flourish throughout the multiverse, protecting emerging civilizations from threats they were not yet equipped to handle, while allowing them sufficient freedom to explore their own potential. The role of locations like Gravity Falls within these cosmic systems appeared to be that of testing grounds and training facilities, places where consciousness could encounter controlled doses of expanded reality while developing the wisdom and stability necessary to handle greater levels of cosmic awareness responsibly. The challenges and opportunities presented by supernatural phenomena served as evolutionary pressures that encouraged the development of mental and spiritual capabilities that would be essential for successful interaction with the broader cosmic community. The individuals who successfully navigated these challenges without being destroyed or corrupted by them demonstrated qualities of resilience, adaptability, and moral integrity that marked them as potential candidates for roles in the cosmic governance systems that maintained order and meaning throughout the multiverse. Their experiences in dealing with anomalous phenomena provided them with skills and perspectives that could be invaluable in addressing similar challenges in other locations and dimensions. Yet the selection and preparation of such individuals appeared to be a gradual and subtle process that operated through natural development rather than direct intervention. The cosmic systems seem designed to identify and nurture potential without compromising the authenticity of the growth process through excessive guidance or protection from necessary struggles and failures. The mysteries that emerge from these investigations touched upon questions that might never be fully resolved through any form of analysis or investigation available to human consciousness. The ultimate nature of reality, the purpose of existence, the relationship between consciousness and the physical universe, and the meaning of individual identity in a cosmos of infinite possibilities might remain forever beyond complete understanding, not because of limitations in knowledge or methodology, but because of the fundamental structure of existence itself. Some truths might be too large for any finite consciousness to contain completely, requiring instead a form of understanding that involved participation and integration rather than intellectual analysis. The deepest mysteries might be meant to be lived rather than solved, experienced rather than explained, embraced rather than conquered through the application of sufficient knowledge and logical reasoning. The recognition of these limitations paradoxically opened new possibilities for growth and development that transcended the boundaries of conventional learning and understanding. By acknowledging the existence of truths too vast for complete comprehension, consciousness could develop forms of wisdom that involved knowing how to live meaningfully within mystery, rather than requiring complete certainty before taking action or making commitments. This wisdom involved learning to distinguish between mysteries that were worth pursuing and those that were better accepted as permanent features of existence, between questions that could be answered through investigation and those that could only be engaged through direct participation in the phenomena they addressed. The development of such discrimination represented one of the most important capabilities that contact with cosmic-level reality could provide. The ultimate mystery that emerged from all these investigations was not any specific question about the nature of supernatural phenomena or cosmic governance systems, but rather the simple fact that mystery itself seemed to be a fundamental and irreducible feature of existence. No matter how much knowledge was gained or how sophisticated analytical frameworks became, new layers of unknown and unknowable phenomena continued to reveal themselves, suggesting that mystery was not a temporary condition to be eliminated through sufficient understanding, but an essential aspect of what made existence meaningful and valuable. This recognition transformed the entire enterprise of investigation and understanding from a quest for complete knowledge into a form of participation in the ongoing creative process through which reality continued to unfold and develop new possibilities. The role of consciousness in this process was not simply to observe and catalogue phenomena, but to actively contribute to the evolution of meaning and value through the quality of its engagement with mystery itself. The greatest cipher that Gravity Falls had revealed was thus not any specific code or symbolic system, but rather the recognition that existence itself was a vast and ongoing communication between levels of reality too complex for any single perspective to encompass completely. Learning to participate skillfully in this communication represented the ultimate challenge and opportunity that contact with cosmic mysteries could provide. The deepest wisdom that emerged from humanity's encounter with the cosmic mysteries concentrated in Gravity Falls was not the accumulation of specific knowledge about supernatural phenomena or interdimensional physics, but rather the profound understanding that comes from learning to find peace and meaning within the embrace of ultimate mystery itself. This was a form of comprehension that transcended the traditional boundaries between knowledge and ignorance, between certainty and doubt, revealing that the most important truths about existence might be discovered not through the resolution of questions, but through the cultivation of a consciousness capable of dwelling comfortably within questions too vast for any finite mind to answer completely. The philosophical implications of this realization extended far beyond the specific circumstances of gravity falls into territories that challenged the fundamental assumptions upon which human civilization had built its approaches to learning, problem-solving, and the pursuit of understanding. For centuries, the dominant intellectual tradition had operated under the assumption that mystery was primarily a temporary condition, a gap in knowledge that could eventually be filled through sufficient investigation, analysis, and theoretical development. This mechanistic approach to understanding had achieved remarkable successes in mapping the behavior of physical systems and developing technologies that could manipulate material reality with unprecedented precision and power. Yet the encounter with cosmic-level phenomena revealed limitations in this methodology that went beyond simple questions of insufficient data or inadequate analytical tools, pointing toward fundamental structural features of reality that might be permanently beyond the reach of conventional investigative approaches. The beings like Cipher, who possessed vastly expanded awareness and knowledge, demonstrated that even cosmic intelligence could not achieve complete understanding of existence without encountering new layers of mystery that challenged their own frameworks of comprehension. The demon's ultimate defeat had resulted not from his lack of knowledge or power, but from his inability to understand truths about consciousness and meaning that could only be grasped through forms of wisdom that transcended mere intellectual analysis or the accumulation of information. This suggested that mystery was not simply a function of limited perspective or insufficient development, but was woven into the fundamental structure of existence itself, serving purposes that went far beyond merely challenging the problem-solving capabilities of conscious beings. Mystery appeared to play essential roles in maintaining the conditions necessary for meaningful existence, creating spaces for growth, creativity, and discovery that would be eliminated if complete knowledge were ever achieved. The recognition of mystery as a positive and necessary feature of reality, rather than a problem to be solved, opened entirely new approaches to understanding that emphasized participation, relationship, and integration rather than analysis, control, and domination. These approaches acknowledged that the most important aspects of existence, including consciousness, meaning, love, and beauty, might be fundamentally mysterious, not because of limitations in current understanding, but because their essential nature involved qualities that transcended the categories through which analytical thinking operated. The development of wisdom capable of engaging meaningfully with such mysteries required forms of learning that incorporated not only intellectual analysis, but also emotional intelligence, spiritual development, and what could only be described as the cultivation of wonder itself. This education involved learning to appreciate questions for their own sake rather than simply as stepping stones toward answers, developing the capacity to find fulfillment in exploration and discovery, even when those processes did not lead to definitive conclusions or practical applications. The children who grew up in post-Weirdmageddon gravity falls were developing these capabilities naturally through their exposure to an environment where mystery was not an occasional interruption of normal experience, but a constant and accepted feature of daily life. Their comfort with uncertainty and their ability to function effectively in situations where conventional logic provided inadequate guidance represented evolutionary adaptations that might prove essential for humanity's continued development in a cosmos far stranger and more wonderful than previous generations had imagined. These young people demonstrated remarkable resilience and creativity when confronted with phenomena that would have bewildered or terrified adults whose consciousness had been shaped by more conventional environments. They approached supernatural occurrences with curiosity rather than fear, treating them as opportunities for exploration and learning rather than as threats to their understanding of how reality should behave. Most significantly, they showed an intuitive understanding of the relationship between consciousness and mystery that allowed them to participate in anomalous phenomena without being overwhelmed or corrupted by experiences that exceeded their analytical capabilities. They seemed to grasp instinctively that some forms of understanding required engagement and participation rather than detached observation, and that the most important lessons might emerge through direct experience rather than through theoretical analysis. This participatory approach to understanding represented a fundamental shift from the subject-object dualism that had dominated Western intellectual tradition, proposing instead a form of consciousness that could recognize its own involvement in the phenomena it sought to understand. Rather than attempting to maintain complete objectivity and analytical detachment, this approach acknowledged that consciousness itself was an active participant in the unfolding of reality, capable of influencing and being influenced by the very mysteries it encountered. The implications of this participatory worldview extended into every area of human activity, from scientific research and technological development to artistic expression and spiritual practice. In each domain, the recognition that consciousness played an active role in shaping the phenomena being investigated opened possibilities for forms of knowledge and capability that purely analytical approaches could never achieve. Scientific research conducted from this perspective incorporated elements of intuition, empathy, and what researchers described as communion with the phenomena being studied, creating methodologies that could access aspects of natural systems that remained invisible to purely objective investigation. These approaches did not abandon intellectual rigor or systematic observation, but integrated them with forms of awareness that acknowledged the researcher's relationship with and responsibility to the systems they were studying. Artistic expression evolved to incorporate not only the representation of mystery, but also the creation of works that served as vehicles for the direct transmission of mysterious experience. Rather than simply depicting supernatural phenomena or cosmic themes, artists learned to create pieces that actually functioned as doorways through which audiences could encounter expanded states of consciousness and perception. Spiritual practice developed frameworks for engaging with cosmic mysteries that emphasized direct experience and personal transformation, rather than belief in specific doctrines or adherence to prescribed rituals. These approaches recognize that the most profound spiritual truths might be inherently personal and experiential, requiring individual discovery and integration rather than external validation or institutional authority. The integration of these various approaches to mystery created a form of culture that was simultaneously more grounded in direct experience and more open to transcendent possibilities than either purely materialistic or purely spiritual traditions could achieve independently. This culture acknowledged both the reality and importance of physical existence and the presence of dimensions of meaning and value that extended far beyond material considerations. The economic and social structures that emerged from this cultural foundation operated according to principles that balanced individual development with collective responsibility, recognizing that personal growth and community well-being were fundamentally interconnected rather than potentially conflicting objectives. The wisdom gained through engagement with cosmic mysteries provided frameworks for cooperation and mutual support that could address social challenges without requiring the suppression of individual creativity and spiritual development. Most importantly, this culture developed approaches to decision-making and problem-solving that could function effectively, even when dealing with situations where complete information was unavailable and where the consequences of choices might not become apparent for generations. These approaches emphasized wisdom, intuition, and long-term thinking rather than immediate gratification or short-term optimization, creating social systems that could adapt and evolve in response to changing circumstances while maintaining essential values and purposes. The educational institutions that emerged to support this cultural development incorporated mystery as a central element of curricula, rather than treating it as an obstacle to learning. Students learned to appreciate questions that had no definitive answers, to find meaning in exploration that might not lead to practical applications, and to develop forms of understanding that integrated intellectual, emotional, and spiritual development into coherent approaches to living. These educational approaches produced individuals who were simultaneously more capable of dealing with complexity and uncertainty, and more appreciative of simplicity and wonder. They could engage effectively with advanced theoretical concepts and sophisticated technological systems while maintaining their capacity for direct experience of beauty, meaning, and mystery in ordinary life situations. The long-term implications of these developments suggested possibilities for human evolution that transcended the traditional boundaries between individual and collective development, between material and spiritual progress, and between local and cosmic scales of awareness and responsibility. Humanity might be developing capabilities that would allow it to function as a mature participant in cosmic systems of consciousness and meaning that operated across multiple dimensions and vast timescales. Yet this development was not inevitable or guaranteed, but depended upon choices that each generation would need to make about the kinds of consciousness and culture they wanted to cultivate. The encounter with cosmic mysteries provided opportunities for growth and transformation, but it also created responsibilities and challenges that could only be met through wisdom, courage, and commitment to values that transcended immediate self-interest or short-term convenience. The ultimate mystery that emerged from all these investigations and developments was the question of whether humanity would prove capable of the moral and spiritual maturity necessary to handle the expanded awareness and capability that contact with cosmic consciousness made possible. This was not a question that could be answered through analysis or prediction, but only through the actual choices and actions of individuals and communities, as they encountered opportunities to participate in the ongoing evolution of consciousness and meaning throughout the cosmos. The recognition that this question could only be answered through living rather than thinking, through being rather than analyzing, represented perhaps the most profound transformation in human consciousness that the Gravity Falls experience had produced. It suggested that the deepest truths about existence were not problems to be solved, but realities to be embodied, not concepts to be understood, but ways of being, to be cultivated and expressed through the quality of daily life and relationship. In learning to dwell peacefully within this ultimate mystery, while remaining actively engaged with the challenges and opportunities of existence, humanity might discover forms of fulfillment and meaning that transcended the traditional boundaries between knowledge and ignorance, between certainty and doubt, between the known and the unknowable. The greatest cipher might thus be the recognition that existence itself was a form of communication between levels of consciousness too vast for any single perspective to encompass, and that learning to participate skillfully in this communication was both the greatest challenge and the most profound opportunity that cosmic awareness could provide. And so our journey through the ciphers and mysteries of Gravity Falls draws to its contemplative close, like the gentle settling of autumn leaves after a day of revelation and wonder. We have decoded ancient symbols, unraveled interdimensional conspiracies, and glimpsed truths that exist beyond the boundaries of ordinary understanding, following pathways of knowledge that led us from the simplest substitution codes to cosmic mysteries that challenge the very foundations of what it means to know and to be. Yet perhaps the greatest mystery of all is not one that can be solved with cipher wheels or journal entries, but rather the simple truth that some questions are more beautiful than their answers. In a world where every secret can eventually be decoded, where every cipher has its key, there remains something profound about the act of wondering itself, about the moment of standing before the unknown with curiosity rather than conquest as our guiding principle. We have traced the evolution of mystery from Stanford Pine's first tentative observations of impossible creatures to Bill Cipher's cosmic assault upon reality itself, witnessing how each revelation opened doorways to deeper questions, how each answer became the foundation for more sophisticated forms of not knowing. The journals that documented these discoveries became artifacts, not merely of accumulated knowledge, but of the journey of consciousness, as it learned to expand its capacity for wonder without losing its grounding in meaning and purpose. The town of Gravity Falls sleeps peacefully now beneath stars that shine with familiar light, its supernatural residents settled into their eternal routines of mystery and magic. The dimensional barriers hold firm but permeable, allowing just enough strangeness to seep through to keep life interesting without overwhelming the careful balance that makes ordinary existence possible and precious. The journals rest safely in their appointed places, their cipher systems intact and ready to guide future generations of seekers who approach their mysteries with both courage and wisdom. The children who played in streets where geometry occasionally forgot its own rules have grown into adults who carry within their consciousness a comfort with uncertainty that previous generations could never have imagined. They move through a world that others might find bewildering with the natural grace of beings who learned early that mystery was not an enemy to be defeated but a friend to be welcomed, a constant companion that enriched experience rather than diminishing it. Bill Cipher's chaos has been transformed back into the quiet mysteries that make life worth exploring. His nightmare visions replaced by dreams that acknowledge both wonder and responsibility. The portal that once threatened to dissolve the boundaries between order and madness has become a symbol of the delicate balance necessary to maintain openness to transcendence while preserving the structures that make meaning possible. In the end, we discover that the true cipher was never hidden in any single code or symbol, but was distributed throughout the entire experience of learning to live consciously within mystery. Each decoded message revealed not ultimate answers but better questions. Each solved puzzle opened pathways to more sophisticated forms of appreciation for the inexhaustible depths that consciousness could explore without ever reaching a final destination. The symbols on the cipher wheel continue to pulse with significance that evolves as our understanding deepens, their meanings shifting and developing as we ourselves grow in wisdom and capability. They remind us that the most important truths are not static facts to be memorized, but living relationships to be cultivated, not problems to be solved once and forgotten, but realities to be engaged afresh with each moment of genuine attention. Rest now in the knowledge that mysteries surround us always, not as problems to be solved, but as invitations to wonder, as doorways through which consciousness can expand its appreciation for the magnificent complexity that underlies even the simplest moments of existence. Let the ciphers and secrets drift through your dreams like whispered promises of adventures yet to come, carrying with them the understanding that every ending is also a beginning, every solution the foundation for deeper questions. The mystery continues, not because our investigations have been inadequate, but because mystery itself is the inexhaustible source from which all meaning flows, the cosmic conversation of which our individual consciousness represents both a unique voice and an attentive listener. In learning to participate skillfully in this conversation, we discover that truth proves stronger than any force that seeks to diminish it. that wonder endures beyond every attempt to reduce it to mere mechanism, and that the deepest satisfaction comes not from having all our questions answered, but from learning to ask questions worthy of the magnificent mystery that existence itself represents.